Why Antony and Cleopatra's love was doomed. The hidden psychology behind history's most famous romance. The torches in the tent are burning low. Outside, the sea is restless, slapping against 300 ships anchored along the Greek coastline. It is the 2nd of September, 31 years before the birth of a man whose name will eventually replace every god currently being prayed to in this camp. Right now, none of that matters. Right now there is only a man and a woman alone, and a silence neither one of them knows how to break. Mark Antony is 49 years old. He has spent his entire adult life as the second most powerful man in the largest empire the world has ever seen, and for the past several years he has been trying, quietly, and then not so quietly, to become the first. Tomorrow at dawn, his fleet will sail out to meet Octavian's navy at a place called Actium. One of two things will happen. Either Antony becomes the undisputed ruler of Rome, or he loses everything he has ever built. There is no third option. There hasn't been a third option for a long time. Cleopatra sits across from him. She is the Queen of Egypt, the last pharaoh of an ancient bloodline that has ruled the Nile for 3,000 years. And she has come tonight not as a monarch and not entirely as a lover either. She has come as something harder to name. She wears no crown. Her hair is down. And for the first time in their 11 years together, she asks him a question she has never dared to ask before. If you had to choose, she says, her voice low, almost gentle, between me and Rome, what would you choose? You would think that after 11 years, after 2 children, after a war he is fighting partly because of her and partly in spite of everyone telling him not to, the answer would come fast. It doesn't. Antony looks at her. He opens his mouth and he says nothing at all. The silence that follows is the loudest sound in this entire story. We're going to come back to that exact moment near the very end of everything that happens between these two people. Hold on to it, because the real tragedy of Cleopatra and Antony was never that he had to choose and chose wrong. The real tragedy is that somewhere along the way, the man who once commanded armies with a single word had quietly lost the ability to answer that question at all. This is not a story about a seductress who lured a great man into ruin. It is not a story about a foolish general who let lust override his judgment. It is not a story about an empire lost because 2 people fell in love. It is a story about something far more familiar than any of that. Something that has nothing to do with crowns or armies. It's a story about what happens when a person loves someone so completely that they stop being able to find the edges of themselves. If you have ever loved someone like that, past the point where you could see clearly, past the point where your friends started looking at you differently, past the point where you could even remember what you wanted before you wanted them, then somewhere inside this 2,000-year-old love story, you are going to recognize yourself. You might think you already know how this ends. An asp, a tragedy, a famous line about a kiss. But stay with me, because the part almost nobody tells you is how it began. And the beginning explains everything the ending doesn't. The girl who inherited a battlefield lets go back. Not 11 years, but decades. To a 14-year-old girl who inherited a kingdom and a family that would have killed her for it without blinking. Cleopatra was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek Macedonian family that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries by the time she arrived. Descendants of one of Alexander the Great's own generals, who had carved out the richest kingdom on earth for himself after Alexander's death, and handed it down generation after generation. Not through a family that solved its political problems the way you'd expect from people raised to believe they were living gods. Murder, frequently, often between siblings, sometimes between a parent and a child. By the time Cleopatra turned 18, she had already watched this pattern up close. Her own family tree was less a tree and more a battlefield with branches. She had brothers who would, within a few years, try to have her killed. She had a sister who actually succeeded in seizing the throne out from under her for a brief, brutal period. This was not a childhood that taught you to trust easily. It was a childhood that taught you every single day, that love and survival were the same skill, and you had better be excellent at both, because the moment you weren't, somebody in your own family would happily replace you. Here's the part most people miss when they imagine Cleopatra. She wasn't, by most accounts, conventionally the most beautiful woman of her era. Ancient sources describe her face as striking rather than flawless. What made her dangerous? What made kings and generals reorganize their entire lives around her was something else entirely. She spoke at least 7 languages fluently, an almost unheard of feat for any ruler of her time. She had studied philosophy, medicine, rhetoric, and mathematics, and she understood, with a precision that should genuinely unsettle you, exactly how to make a powerful man feel like the single most interesting person who had ever existed. That isn't a criticism. That's a survival skill, forged in a household where the wrong impression on the wrong day could end with you exiled, or worse. There's a piece of Cleopatra's childhood worth returning to here, because it sets up something essential about how she approached every major relationship of her adult life. When she was a child, her father, Ptolemy XII, was deposed and exiled from Egypt for several years following a popular uprising in Alexandria, leaving young Cleopatra and her siblings in a palace controlled by factions actively hostile to her family's return. During that period, one of her older sisters, Berenice, seized the throne for herself. When their father eventually returned to Egypt with Roman military support and reclaimed his crown, he had Berenice executed without hesitation. Cleopatra was somewhere between 10 and 14 years old when this happened. She watched her own sister killed for reaching toward the same throne. Cleopatra herself would eventually inherit. This wasn't an isolated horror in an otherwise gentle childhood. It was simply how the Ptolemaic family operated. Generation after generation, a pattern so consistent that historians studying the dynasty have noted it as one of the most violently self-destructive royal families in the ancient world. Here's why this matters for understanding everything that came afterward in Cleopatra's relationship with Antony. Children who grow up inside this kind of chronic, family-based existential threat often develop what psychologists studying childhood trauma call hypervigilant attachment, an acute, finely tuned sensitivity to shifts in power, loyalty, and danger within their closest relationships. Because their actual survival, from the earliest possible age, depended on reading those shifts correctly and acting on them faster than anyone around them. This explains something that has puzzled historians for centuries. Why a woman as obviously intelligent as Cleopatra, capable of mastering 7 languages and running one of the wealthiest kingdoms on earth with genuine administrative skill, would eventually allow herself to become so completely fused with a single relationship that she lost the independent judgment others tried, too late, to warn Antony about. The answer isn't that Cleopatra was simply swept away by romantic feeling, the way popular mythology suggests. It's that the hypervigilant, all-consuming attentiveness she developed as a survival skill in a murderous childhood household. The same skill that let her read a room perfectly within moments of walking into it, became, over a decade with Antony, indistinguishable from genuine romantic devotion. For Cleopatra, attentiveness and survival had never actually been separate things. Before we leave her childhood behind, it's worth knowing what she did with all of that vigilance once she actually held power. Because the same woman capable of reading a room for danger was also, by every surviving account, a genuinely gifted administrator. In the years before she ever met a Roman general, Egypt suffered a catastrophic string of low Nile floods, the kind that, in a bad year, could mean the difference between a full granary and a famine. Cleopatra, still in her early 20s, and fighting to hold her own throne against her brother's court, issued decrees suspending certain tax collections in the hardest-hit regions and opened royal granaries to stabilize the price of grain in Alexandria, a city that could turn violently on a ruler who let its people go hungry. It's easy to read this, looking back, as simple political survival, and it was that too, but it was also competent, detailed governance carried out by someone barely out of her teens, in a language and a bureaucratic system she had mastered well enough to actually use. That combination, genuine administrative skill paired with a nervous system permanently tuned for threat, is the woman who would eventually meet Julius Caesar, the carpet, and what it actually meant. There's a parallel worth drawing here to a woman named Anna, 29, raised by a father with severe untreated bipolar disorder, whose moods could shift without warning from warm and engaged to cold and frightening within the same afternoon. Anna grew into adulthood with an almost supernatural ability to read the emotional temperature of a room within seconds of walking into it. A skill that served her well professionally, in a career built around crisis negotiation. But that also, her therapist eventually helped her understand, made her chronically unable to relax into any relationship that felt genuinely safe and predictable. Because safety had never been associated with love in her nervous system. Only vigilance had. Anna spent 2 years in a relationship with a man who was, by every external measure, kind and stable, and found herself to her own confusion, growing increasingly anxious and dissatisfied the longer the relationship remained calm. It took real therapeutic work for Anna to understand that she wasn't bored by stability. She was, in a much deeper sense, suspicious of it, because her entire nervous system had been trained from early childhood to associate love with constant monitoring rather than restful trust. This pattern offers a piece of the puzzle for understanding why Cleopatra and Antony's relationship sustained the intensity it did for over a decade instead of settling, the way most relationships eventually do, into calmer waters. For Cleopatra, calm waters may never have felt entirely trustworthy. The crisis, the stakes, the constant vigilance her relationship with Antony required wasn't simply imposed on her by external political circumstances. It may have been, at some deep psychological level, the only emotional register in which she actually knew how to love. This doesn't diminish what she felt for Antony. If anything, it deepens it and makes it more tragic, because it suggests that even in her most genuine moments of devotion, Cleopatra was working with emotional tools forged in a childhood that never gave her the chance to learn any other way of loving. Now hold on to that, because we're about to watch it in action. When Cleopatra was 21, she found herself locked out of her own palace by her younger brother and his advisors, who had decided she was no longer useful to the throne. Around the same time, Julius Caesar, already the most powerful man in Rome, already 52, already married, arrived in Alexandria chasing a political rival. Cleopatra needed an audience with him, but she couldn't simply walk through the front gates of her own city without being arrested or killed by her brother's men. So, according to the most famous version of this story, recorded generations later, she had herself smuggled into the palace rolled inside a carpet, in some versions a sack of bedding, carried past the guards by a single loyal servant, and unrolled directly in front of Caesar. Here's the part most retellings get wrong, even 2,000 years later. That wasn't seduction for its own sake. It was a woman who understood, with total clarity, that she had exactly one chance to be seen by the one person who could save her life and her throne, and she was not going to waste it standing politely in a waiting room. Psychologists today would call what Cleopatra did in that moment an extreme form of strategic vulnerability, choosing, deliberately, to be unguarded in front of someone powerful at exactly the moment it would have the most impact. It worked. Caesar restored her to power within weeks, and within months she was pregnant with his son. Pay attention to what happened next, because it explains the rest of Cleopatra's entire emotional life. For 3 years, Cleopatra lived something close to what we would now call a real partnership with Caesar. She traveled to Rome and lived openly in one of his estates, while his actual wife remained at home, an arrangement that scandalized Roman society, but didn't seem to bother Caesar in the slightest. They had a son together, a boy she named Caesarion, Little Caesar. There is reasonable historical evidence that Caesar intended, eventually, to find some way to legitimize that child, possibly even naming him an heir, though Roman law made that almost impossible. Then, on the Ides of March, 44 years before the birth of Christ, a group of senators surrounded Julius Caesar on the floor of the Roman Senate and stabbed him 23 times. Cleopatra was in Rome when it happened. She had to flee the city within weeks, taking her 3-year-old son back to Egypt. Watching from a distance as the empire her son's father had built collapsed into a civil war between the men who wanted to inherit it. Here's the part no school ever teaches you about loss like that: grief and political terror. When they happen at the same time, don't process the way ordinary grief does. There's no room to fall apart. Cleopatra didn't get to spend that year crying. She spent it calculating who was going to win the war for Rome, and which side she needed to be standing next to when the fighting stopped. Because the wrong answer wouldn't just cost her a broken heart, it would cost her kingdom, and quite possibly her son's life, a question that never gets a clean answer. This is something a 28-year-old woman named Olivia understands in a much smaller, much quieter way. 2,000 years later, in an apartment in Chicago, Olivia met a man during her last year of graduate school. Funny, a little reckless, with a way of making her feel like the only interesting thing happening in any room. For 2 years she loved him with the kind of total undivided attention most people reserve for a child or a crisis. And he loved her back sometimes, on his own schedule, with his hand on the brake the entire time. He never quite said he didn't want a future with her. He also never quite said he did. And whenever Olivia tried to ask him directly, "Where is this going? What do you actually want?" he had an almost magical gift for changing the subject just enough that she forgot, for another 6 months, that she'd never actually gotten an answer. Psychologists have a name for the pattern Olivia was caught in: anxious attachment. It isn't a character flaw. It's an emotional map, formed early, usually in childhood, about whether the people who are supposed to love you can be counted on to actually show up. Olivia's father had been like that too, present, then suddenly gone, then present again, never explaining the gaps. Children who grow up with that kind of intermittent reinforcement, present, absent, no predictable pattern at all, often grow into adults who mistake uncertainty for chemistry. Not knowing starts to feel like passion. The anxiety starts to feel like love. It took Olivia 2 years and one brutal birthday, spent entirely alone while he was busy texting her at 11 at night like nothing had happened, to finally understand that what she'd been calling love for 2 years was actually her own nervous system, trained from childhood, mistaking a question mark for a person. Here's the connection, and stay with me, because it matters. Cleopatra at 21, smuggled into a palace in a carpet, risking everything for one chance with a powerful man. That wasn't anxious attachment. That was survival under genuine literal threat of death. But as we get further into this story, you're going to start seeing a different pattern emerge in Cleopatra's choices. Choices that look less like calculated survival, and more like something closer to what Olivia felt. Something that starts as strategy and slowly, quietly becomes need. Hold on to that thought too, we'll come back to it. Rome in pieces and a general built for rooms. 3 years after Caesar's death, Rome had split into 3 men fighting over the wreckage of an empire. Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old adopted heir, cold and patient and dangerously underestimated. Lepidus, a minor player who would be pushed out within a few years. And Mark Antony, Caesar's most trusted general, the man who had stood up at Caesar's funeral and turned a grieving Roman crowd into a mob hungry for revenge against the assassins. Antony was, by every account from the period, the kind of man rooms were built around. Tall, physically powerful, famous for his appetite for wine and parties and a good fight, beloved by his soldiers in a way the cerebral, calculating Octavian never quite managed to be. He had already been married 3 times and had a long, well-documented history of letting passion override every ounce of political caution he possessed. In 41 BC, needing Egypt's wealth and grain to fund yet another military campaign, Antony summoned the Queen of Egypt to meet him in the city of Tarsus, in what is now southern Turkey, to answer for accusations that she had aided his enemies. Cleopatra had met one Roman general before. She knew with total precision, exactly how to make an entrance a man would remember for the rest of his life. Picture the Cydnus River in the summer of 41 BC. Antony is sitting in Tarsus, waiting the way powerful men wait when they expect someone to come crawling. He has summoned the Queen of Egypt to answer for her loyalty, and he fully expects her to arrive nervous, apologetic, eager to please. What sails up the river instead is a barge with a gilded stern and purple sails, rowed by oars plated in silver that move in time to the sound of flutes and harps. Cleopatra herself reclines beneath a canopy stitched with gold thread, dressed according to accounts written generations later as the goddess Aphrodite, surrounded by boys dressed as cupids fanning her, while the air around the boat fills with the smell of burning incense drifting all the way to shore. Antony sends word that she should come to him. She sends word back. If he wants to see her, He can come to her. He goes. Here's the part most retellings get completely backward. People love to frame this moment as Cleopatra seducing a vulnerable man with perfume and theater. But watch what's actually happening. Antony was 42 years old. He had been to war more times than he could count. He had seen real spectacle, real wealth, real power his entire adult life. A boat with nice sails should not have been enough to undo a man like that. What undid him wasn't the boat. It was that for the first time in longer than he could remember, somebody had built an entire afternoon, an entire performance, an entire world, around the singular goal of making him feel like the most significant man alive, and she had done it without asking him for anything first. No requests, no complaints about his army camping near her borders, no mention that first night of the political accusations he'd summoned her to answer for. Just an evening designed with total precision to make Mark Antony feel like the center of the universe. Psychologists will tell you this is one of the most effective and most dangerous things one human being can do to another, and it isn't manipulation in the cartoonish sense people usually mean. It's something subtler, the deliberate, skillful creation of total attention. And total attention, when you've spent your whole life starved of it without realizing you were starved, can feel indistinguishable from destiny. By the end of that first banquet, and there were several, each one more extravagant than the last, Cleopatra reportedly once dissolving an enormous pearl in vinegar and drinking it just to demonstrate the scale of Egypt's wealth. Antony had forgotten entirely why he'd summoned her in the first place. He didn't punish her, He didn't even interrogate her about the accusations. He followed her back to Alexandria instead, and stayed there with her for the winter. That winter, the two of them threw themselves into something the city started calling, half mockingly and half admiringly, the Society of Inimitable Livers, a club dedicated to extravagant feasting, drinking, gambling, practical jokes, and general excess, the two most powerful people on earth behaving, for months at a time, like the world's most expensive teenagers. There's a story, possibly true, possibly exaggerated by later Roman historians eager to make Antony look ridiculous, about Antony going fishing with Cleopatra, and secretly having a diver attach an already caught fish to his hook underwater, so he could pull it up and impress her. And Cleopatra, who apparently saw through the trick immediately, having her own diver attach an already dried, salted fish to his line the next day instead, in front of his entire entourage, just to humiliate him publicly and lovingly at the same time. That's not the behavior of a calculating queen executing a political strategy. That's the behavior of two people who have, somewhere in the space of a few months, genuinely fallen for each other. But here's the part most couples watching this need to sit with. Falling for someone, and being equipped to build a stable life with them, are not automatically the same thing. And the gap between those two things is exactly where this story finds its first real wound. What Sarah's marriage counselor heard. Let's talk about Sarah for a moment. She's 42, lives outside Phoenix, married 20 years with 2 kids in high school. When she was 23, she met a man at a wedding who made her laugh harder than she had in years. Who showed up at her apartment with flowers for no reason, who talked about the future. In a way that made her feel, for the first time, like somebody actually saw the life she wanted and wanted to build it with her. 20 years later, sitting across from a marriage counselor for the first time, Sarah said something that stopped the room. I don't think I ever stopped loving him. I think I stopped existing somewhere around year 12, and he just didn't notice, because the version of me that disappeared was the version that used to ask for things. The psychologist Robert Sternberg spent decades trying to understand exactly what Sarah was describing, and he built what he called the triangular theory of love to explain it. Sternberg argued that love is made of 3 separate ingredients: intimacy, the emotional closeness and trust between two people; passion, a physical and romantic intensity; and commitment, the conscious decision to stay, to build, to keep choosing each other on the boring days as much as the exciting ones. Different combinations of those 3 ingredients produce entirely different kinds of love. Passion without intimacy or commitment is what Sternberg calls infatuation. Intense, thrilling, and almost always temporary. Intimacy and commitment without much passion is companionate love, stable, often deeply loving but missing the spark. Only when all three are present together, fully and consistently, do you arrive at what he calls consummate love. The kind most people are actually hoping to find when they say they want a soulmate. Here's the part most couples never get told directly. Consummate love isn't a destination you arrive at once and keep forever. It's a balance you have to actively rebuild again and again for decades, because the three ingredients don't naturally stay in proportion. Passion fades on its own timeline whether you manage it or not. Commitment can calcify into routine if nobody keeps choosing intimacy on purpose. And intimacy, real, vulnerable, I see you and you see me intimacy, is the ingredient most couples accidentally let erode first, because it's the one that requires the most ongoing effort and the least obvious payoff. What Sarah had in those early years with her husband was overwhelming passion and a fast, intoxicating sense of intimacy. What she didn't have, what neither of them ever consciously built, was a sustained architecture of commitment that kept renewing the other two as the marriage aged, and the kids arrived and the bills piled up. By year 12, the passion had quietly drained out. By year 15, the intimacy had gone with it, replaced by two people efficiently running a household together. What was left wasn't love in Sternberg's full sense at all. It was logistics dressed up in a wedding ring. Now hold that framework in mind, because it explains something crucial about what was actually happening in Alexandria that winter. What Cleopatra and Antony had, almost from their very first encounter, was enormous, overwhelming passion, and a startlingly fast, intense form of intimacy, the kind that comes from two people who instantly recognize in each other an equal, someone who can match wit for wit, ambition for ambition, appetite for appetite. What they did not have, not yet, and arguably not ever in any stable, sustained way, was commitment in Sternberg's sense, the boring, daily, structural choosing of each other over every competing obligation. Because Antony, at the exact moment he was falling deeper into this relationship, still had a wife waiting in Rome, still had an empire to help run, and still had political enemies sharpening their knives the entire time he was dissolving pearls in vinegar. 4 years and a reunion that skipped the hard part that winter ended. Antony left Alexandria. Cleopatra, we now know, was pregnant with twins. He didn't see her again for nearly 4 years. This is the part of the story that gets skipped over almost every time someone tells it, and it's the part that matters most, because in those 4 years apart, Antony's life in Rome did not stand still. His wife, Fulvia, a formidable, politically active woman in her own right, who had actually led troops in a brief uprising against Octavian, historians believe partly out of frustration with Antony's absence, rather than jealousy over Cleopatra, died suddenly while Antony was away. In the aftermath, trying to repair the increasingly fractured alliance with Octavian, Antony agreed to marry Octavian's own sister. Her name was Octavia. We're going to spend real time with Octavia later in this story, because what happened to her deserves far more attention than most versions of this tale give it. For now, here's what you need to know. By every surviving account, Octavia was intelligent, gracious, and genuinely devoted to Antony. She bore him 2 daughters. She managed his affairs in Rome with real competence while he was away. She was, in almost every measurable sense, exactly the kind of stable-fitted partner Sternberg's framework says a lasting love requires. And 4 years after leaving Alexandria, Antony left her too. Not formally, not yet, but in every way that matters. He summoned Cleopatra to meet him again, this time in the Syrian city of Antioch. He had been gone 4 years. He didn't know about the twins until he saw them. Here's the part. No school ever teaches you about reunions like that one. The years apart don't dissolve an intense early connection. If anything, distance and time tend to simplify a complicated relationship in your memory, sanding off every rough edge, every argument, every moment of doubt, until what's left in your mind is a concentrated, uncomplicated version of how good it felt. Antony hadn't spent 4 years thinking about Cleopatra's political calculations, or the practical complications of loving a foreign queen while running half of Rome's empire. He'd spent 4 years remembering a pearl dissolving in vinegar, a fish on a hook, an evening on a golden barge that made him feel, for the only time in his adult life, like the most important man who had ever lived. When he saw her again in Antioch and met the two children he hadn't known existed, something in him appears to have simply stopped resisting. Historians genuinely disagree about exactly why, but most agree this is the turning point, where Antony's relationship with Cleopatra stops being an affair on the side of an otherwise functional political and married life, and starts becoming the gravitational center around which everything else in his life will eventually be rearranged or destroyed. He never went back to Octavia, in any meaningful sense after this. He kept her name on paper for political utility for several more years. But from this point forward, his actual life, his actual home, his actual children he watched grow, his actual partner, in every sense that matters, was in Alexandria. This is where Olivia's story, the one we started with, comes back into focus. Remember the man who never quite said he didn't want a future with her, and never quite said he did. Remember how the not knowing started to feel, eventually, like passion. What Olivia eventually learned in therapy, 2 years after that relationship finally ended, was something that applies just as much to a Roman general in 36 BC as it does to a 28-year-old in modern-day Chicago. The most intense romantic connections, the ones that feel like fate, like destiny, like nothing else in your life could possibly compare, are very often intense precisely because they're unresolved. Psychologists sometimes call this the Zygomatic effect when applied to relationships. The human brain has a documented tendency to remember and fixate on unfinished tasks far more powerfully than completed ones. An open loop left dangling generates more mental energy, more obsessive thinking, more "I can't stop thinking about this" than something settled and resolved ever does. Antony's relationship with Cleopatra had been, for 4 years, the single most unresolved thing in his life. A child he'd never met, a woman he'd never properly said goodbye to, a question, what exactly are we, that had simply been left hanging in the air of an Alexandrian winter while he went home and married someone else entirely. One thing worth sitting with here before we move on. None of this, not Sternberg's framework, not the Zygomatic effect, not the psychology of unfinished business, makes what Antony did to Octavia acceptable, or makes Cleopatra's growing hold over him purely a matter of brain chemistry rather than choice. Both of them were adults making decisions. Understanding the mechanics underneath a decision is different from excusing it. And if you're watching this and recognizing, uncomfortably, a relationship in your own life that has felt more like an unfinished question than a settled answer, that recognition is worth paying close attention to. Unfinished doesn't mean fated. It just means unfinished. And sometimes the most loving thing two people can do for each other is finally close the loop, one way or the other, instead of letting it run in the background of their lives for years, quietly costing them everything else. The private world with its own logic. By 36 BC, Antony had moved his entire political and personal life to Alexandria. He married Cleopatra according to Egyptian rites, a marriage Rome refused to recognize as legitimate, since Antony was technically still married to Octavia under Roman law, but a marriage that was, in every practical and emotional sense the two of them actually lived, completely real. He had 3 children with Cleopatra now, and he had begun making military, financial, and political decisions that prioritized Egypt's interests in ways Rome could no longer ignore. 600 miles away, a 26-year-old named Octavian was watching every one of these decisions with the patience of a man who understood something Antony, in this period of his life, seemed to have forgotten entirely. That love, however real, however consuming, does not exist in a vacuum. It exists inside a life, and a life eventually sends you the bill for whatever you've been neglecting while you were busy falling. The story people usually tell about this period is that Antony was seduced and controlled, manipulated by a foreign queen into abandoning Rome. The truth the historical record actually supports, when you look closely, is both less dramatic and far more recognizable to anyone who has ever loved someone past the point of good judgment. Antony wasn't controlled, he was changed. And that difference matters enormously, both for understanding this story and for understanding your own life, if you've ever found yourself somewhere you never expected to be. Standing in a version of your own life you wouldn't have recognized a decade earlier. The change happened the way these changes almost always happen, not in one dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small accommodations, each one reasonable on its own, each one slightly reshaping who he was. He adopted Egyptian customs. He let Cleopatra's court etiquette, her language, her way of governing, become his daily reality instead of an interesting visit. He started making promises, territorial gifts, titles for their children, political commitments that made sense inside the world. The two of them had built together in Alexandria, and made almost no sense at all back in Rome, where the only thing that mattered was sounded, whether Antony still looked, and acted like a Roman. This is the part of the story that connects most directly to modern relationships, whatever the stakes actually are. When two people build an intense, all-consuming connection, they don't just fall in love with each other. They very often, slowly and without realizing it, build an entire private world together. A shared language, shared logic, shared values that can drift gradually away from the world either of them came from. Sometimes that's healthy. Sometimes it's exactly what allows two people to grow into something neither could have built alone. But sometimes, and this is the harder, less comfortable truth, that private world becomes a kind of echo chamber, where each partner reinforces the other's choices so consistently that nobody left inside it can tell anymore whether a given decision is wise, or whether it just feels right, because the person they love most in the world agrees with it. Psychologists have a term for what happens when this goes far enough: identity fusion, the point at which a person's sense of self becomes so merged with another person, or with a relationship, that the boundary between me and us essentially dissolves. Some identity fusion is healthy. It's part of what makes long marriages feel like a genuine partnership rather than two roommates managing logistics. But when it goes far enough, a person can lose the ability to evaluate decisions from any perspective except the one they share with their partner. They stop asking, "Is this wise?" and start only ever asking, "Does this serve us?" And the two questions, which used to overlap most of the time, can drift apart without either partner noticing exactly when it happened. Let's bring this down to something smaller. A 44-year-old woman named Vanessa. She married young, at 23, to a man 12 years older, who had, by every external measure, already built the life she thought she was supposed to want: money, status, a house in the right neighborhood. For the first several years, Vanessa told herself, and told everyone who asked, that she was deeply in love, and in a sense she was. But what she was actually in love with, she eventually came to realize in her late 30s, was the version of herself his world allowed her to be: the parties, the recognition, the particular kind of safety that comes from never having to worry about money again. Sternberg's framework would call what Vanessa had something close to fatuous love. Intense commitment paired with passion, but built without the slow, patient development of real intimacy underneath it. It can look from the outside, remarkably like the real thing. It can even feel for years, remarkably like the real thing, especially to the person living inside it. But it's built on a foundation that was never load-bearing in the first place. And when the external scaffolding starts to shake, there's nothing underneath holding the two people together except habit. Vanessa's marriage didn't end in a dramatic betrayal. It ended slowly, over the better part of a year, as she started, almost against her own will, asking herself a question she had successfully avoided for 2 decades. If I took away everything this relationship gives me except the actual person sitting across the table, would I still choose him? She sat with that question for months before she could answer it honestly. When she finally could, the answer broke her heart, because it wasn't really about him being a bad person. It was about realizing that the us she had fused her identity into for 20 years had very little we actually holding it together once the external scaffolding came down. Here's the connection back to Alexandria, worth holding on to as we move forward. What made Cleopatra and Antony's relationship so combustible wasn't that it lacked real intimacy. By every account, it had an abundance of that, an equal, genuine meeting of two formidable minds. What made it combustible was that the us they had built together required an entire empire to keep believing in it, required Rome itself to eventually accept a vision that fused two civilizations, and 2 thrones into 1 inheritance for their children. And empires, unlike individuals, do not fall in love. They calculate. They protect their own legitimacy. And when an empire decides that a relationship has become a threat to its own survival, it does not negotiate with the lovers involved. It declares war, the donations, and the man reading them out loud. In 34 BC, Antony held a public ceremony in Alexandria that Roman senators would later cite as the single clearest piece of evidence that he had abandoned Rome entirely. Historians call it the Donations of Alexandria. Seated on golden thrones in front of a massive crowd, Antony publicly declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings, and named her son with Caesar, Caesarion, as Julius Caesar's true and legitimate heir, a direct public challenge to Octavian's own claim, since Octavian's entire legitimacy rested on being Caesar's adopted son and chosen successor. Antony then divided enormous territories of the Roman East among his own children with Cleopatra, granting them royal titles and lands that, on paper, belonged to Rome. Back in Rome, when word of the ceremony arrived, Octavian didn't need to invent a single exaggeration. He simply read the facts out loud to the Senate and let them do the work for him. Here's the part most couples can actually learn something from, even watching a political catastrophe like this one unfold. When you build a private world with someone you love, a world with its own logic, its own values, but not its own sense of what's reasonable, the danger isn't that the world itself is wrong. The danger is that you stop checking it against anything outside it. Antony genuinely believed, by this point, that what he and Cleopatra were building together, a blended Roman-Egyptian dynasty, ruled jointly, with their children inheriting an empire that spanned 2 civilizations, was visionary, and in a different political climate, with different timing, it might even have been remembered that way. But he made these declarations without ever fully reckoning with how they would read to the only audience whose opinion could actually end him. The city of Rome itself, watching from 600 miles away, increasingly convinced their general had been transformed into something foreign, something other, something no longer theirs. This is the part no school ever teaches you, and it deserves to be said plainly. The people who love us most are not always the safest source of perspective, precisely because they love us most. A partner who has fully fused their identity with yours isn't lying to you when they tell you your decisions make sense. They genuinely believe it, because by that point your logic has become their logic too. That's not a flaw unique to Antony and Cleopatra. It's a universal risk of intense, all-consuming love, and it's exactly why healthy relationships, even the deepest ones, need some thread connecting each partner back to people and perspectives outside the relationship. Friends who will tell you the truth. Family who knew you before. A version of yourself that existed before the fusion started. Octavian's version, and the villain everyone needed. To understand what Octavian was actually doing during these years, you have to understand the kind of man he was. And the kind of man he very deliberately was not. Where Antony was warmth, appetite, and physical presence. The kind of man soldiers would follow into a burning building, because he made you feel like he'd run. In first, Octavian was something colder, and in the long run far more dangerous. He didn't drink to excess. He didn't throw himself into spectacle. He understood, with an instinct that bordered on genius, that in the eyes of the Roman public, restraint reads as virtue, and excess reads as corruption. He spent years patiently, making sure that every story coming out of Alexandria made Antony look less like a Roman general living abroad, and more like a man who had stopped being Roman at all. Octavian wasn't simply a jealous rival, inventing propaganda out of nothing. Antony was, by this point, genuinely making decisions that handed his enemy enormous amounts of material to work with. But Octavian needed Rome to believe something specific, that Antony hadn't chosen any of this, that he had been seduced, manipulated, controlled by a foreign sorceress. A Roman general willingly choosing a foreign queen over his own empire was a far more dangerous story for Octavian to let circulate than a Roman general who had been bewitched against his will. The propaganda Octavian commissioned in these months, poems, speeches, official proclamations, painted Cleopatra as something close to a witch, a seductress whose sexual and supernatural power had stripped a great man of his judgment. That story stuck. It stuck so completely that for nearly 2,000 years afterward, most retellings of this entire saga have centered Cleopatra as the villain, the temptress, the foreign threat. When the historical record, looked at honestly, tells a far more complicated story about two adults, each making their own choices inside a relationship that both of them built together, with eyes open, for reasons that made sense to both of them at the time. This isn't a small footnote. It's a pattern that should sound uncomfortably familiar to anyone who has ever watched a relationship fall apart and noticed how quickly the people around the couple decide there has to be a villain. Usually the partner who is easiest to easiest to paint as the outsider, easiest to blame for choices two people in reality made together. Rarely is there a single villain. There is almost always a pattern, built slowly by both people, out of choices that made sense at the time, reinforced by a private world that stopped checking itself against anything outside it. Understanding that pattern doesn't excuse every choice inside it. But it's a far more useful place to start than looking for someone to blame. By the winter of 32 BC, the fleets were being assembled. Antony had roughly 500 ships and 100,000 soldiers under his command, a force built from his own legions, combined with Cleopatra's Egyptian resources. Octavian, with a cooler and more patient navy under the command of his brilliant Admiral Agrippa, was preparing to meet them. And somewhere in the months leading up to that confrontation, on a night we have already visited once at the very beginning of this story, Cleopatra sat across from the man she had loved for nearly a decade and asked him a question neither one of them was ready to answer. Octavia, the woman flattened into an adjective. Before we follow the fleets to Actium, we need to go back and spend real time with someone this story almost always treats as a footnote. A woman whose entire experience of this love triangle has been flattened for 2,000 years into a single adjective. Wronged. Octavia was, by every surviving account, one of the most respected women in Rome, intelligent, gracious, and by all appearances genuinely devoted to her marriage. She had agreed to marry Antony in the first place, as part of a political peace between her brother Octavian and her new husband, a marriage built from its very first day on the practical architecture of alliance rather than romance. And yet something remarkable happened in the years that followed. Octavia appears to have actually fallen in love with him. She bore him 2 daughters. She managed his properties and political interests in Rome with real skill while he traveled. And when tensions between Antony and her brother threatened to boil over into open war, Octavia personally traveled between the two men, again and again trying to broker peace, not as a passive political pawn, but as a woman actively trying to save a marriage and a fragile empire at the same time. In 35 BC, while Antony was already deeply entangled with Cleopatra in Alexandria, Octavia did something that should stop you in your tracks. She gathered 2,000 soldiers, supplies, and money, and personally led an expedition east to bring them to Antony, who had requested military support for a campaign. It was by any measure an extraordinary act of loyalty and competence. Antony's response was to send her a message before she even reached him, instructing her to turn back. He took the soldiers and the supplies. He did not see her. Here's the part most couples miss, until they're the ones living it. There's a particular kind of pain that doesn't come from a betrayal you can point to. No single dramatic confrontation. No caught red-handed moment. It's the pain of slowly realizing you are doing everything right, showing up competent and loyal and loving, and the person on the other end of all that effort has already emotionally left the building. Octavia wasn't rejected through cruelty, she was rejected through absence. 1,000 small choices that all communicated the same quiet message. You are managing my life, but you are not in it. Psychologists who study long-term relationships will tell you that outright betrayal, as devastating as it is often easier to grieve than the slower, quieter kind of abandonment, because betrayal at least gives you a clear story, a moment, a fact, an injury you can point to and say, this is what happened to me. What Octavia experienced offered no such clarity. There was no affair to discover because there was nothing hidden. Everyone in Rome knew exactly where Antony's heart was. Octavia simply had to keep living inside a marriage everyone around her could see was already over, except, On paper it wasn't. Meghan, and the thing an affair is actually about. Let's bring this forward 2,000 years to a woman named Meghan, 38, living in a suburb outside Denver. Meghan didn't discover her husband's affair through a dramatic confrontation either. She discovered it the way most people actually do. Slowly, through small inconsistencies that accumulated until denial stopped being possible. A late night that didn't quite add up. A phone angled away on the kitchen counter. A particular distance in his eyes during dinner that she'd started attributing to work stress, because the alternative was too frightening to sit with directly. When she finally confronted him, after nearly 10 years of marriage, he didn't deny it. What he said instead was almost worse than a denial would have been. He told her he hadn't meant for it to happen, that it had started slowly. A colleague he talked to more and more, someone who made him feel interesting again in a way he couldn't quite explain, a feeling he hadn't even realized he was missing until he had it back. The therapist Esther Perel, who has spent decades studying exactly this kind of rupture, describes something she has seen constantly in the aftermath of infidelity. The betrayed partner often becomes consumed not just with the fact of the affair, but with every detail of it, replaying conversations, searching for the exact moment things changed, trying to locate the single decision point where everything could have gone differently. Perel's research suggests this isn't simply obsessive thinking. It's the mind's attempt to restore a sense of control over a story that feels like it happened entirely without your knowledge or consent. And here's the part most people watching this need to hear clearly. Whether you're the one who strayed or the one who got left behind in a marriage that was technically still intact, an affair is very rarely actually about the other person. Perel's work emphasizes something that sounds almost contradictory at first. Infidelity is often less about what's missing in the marriage, and more about what's missing in the person who strays. Antony in Alexandria wasn't searching for something Octavia lacked. Octavia was, by every account, exceptional. He was searching for a version of himself he could only seem to access around Cleopatra, the version that felt limitless, like the most significant man who had ever lived, rather than the version that felt increasingly like a Roman general, managing an empire's tedious daily obligations, and a marriage built on duty rather than desire. This is the difference, in Perel's framework between desire and domesticity. Long-term commitment and erotic desire often pull against each other rather than reinforcing one another. The very things that make a relationship feel safe, stable, and secure can, over time quietly erode the sense of mystery and tension that desire actually feeds on. This doesn't mean stable relationships are doomed to lose their spark, but it does mean desire requires active, ongoing attention, precisely because security alone won't sustain it. What Antony found in Cleopatra wasn't simply a more passionate version of love. It was a relationship that never had the chance to calcify into domestic routine, because it was always happening against a backdrop of genuine stakes. Political intrigue, ambition, danger, the constant electricity of two of the most powerful people alive, negotiating both an empire and a partnership at the same time. There was no tedium to escape from in Alexandria. But here's the part most people get wrong about this entire framework, and it matters enormously. The absence of tedium isn't the same thing as the presence of something sustainable. A relationship that runs entirely on intensity, on stakes, on the electric charge of never quite settling into safety can feel more alive than anything else you've ever experienced, and still be structurally incapable of surviving the long, unglamorous work that every real partnership eventually requires. Meghan, 18 months after discovering her husband's affair, made a decision that surprised almost everyone in her life. She didn't leave, but she also didn't simply forgive and return to how things had been before. She told her husband, in language she'd practiced for weeks with her therapist, that she was willing to try rebuilding the marriage, but only if he was willing to do something far harder than apologizing, only if he was willing to figure out honestly what he had actually been missing in himself, separate from what the affair had temporarily provided. 3 years later, Meghan describes her marriage now as genuinely happier than it was before the affair. Not because the affair was somehow good for them, But because the crisis forced both of them to stop running their relationship on autopilot and start actively, consciously rebuilding intimacy, instead of assuming it would maintain itself. That's a version of this story Antony and Cleopatra never got the chance to live out. There was no slow conscious rebuilding available to them, because the entire structure of their relationship existed inside a political emergency that was accelerating, not slowing down. The border a Roman general wasn't supposed to cross. There's a wider cultural backdrop worth understanding here, because it explains something about why Rome reacted to Antony and Cleopatra's relationship with the particular ferocity it did, and because it illuminates a pattern that still shapes how society judges relationships that cross certain invisible lines. Even today, Rome in the 1st century before Christ understood itself as the disciplined, masculine center of civilization, locked in an ongoing cultural rivalry with what it considered the decadent, feminized, mystical East. Egypt chief among the civilizations it viewed this way. This wasn't simply political rhetoric. It was a deeply embedded cultural anxiety, one that shaped how Romans interpreted everything from clothing to religious practice to gender roles. A Roman man who adopted Eastern customs wasn't just making a personal choice in the eyes of his peers. He was understood to be betraying something fundamental about Roman identity itself. This matters enormously for understanding why Antony's relationship with Cleopatra generated such a uniquely vicious backlash. Compared to the countless other affairs and political marriages Roman generals engaged in throughout the same period. It wasn't simply that Antony was unfaithful, or even that he was unfaithful to a politically connected woman. It was that his relationship with Cleopatra came to symbolize, in the Roman imagination, a man who had let himself be absorbed by everything Rome defined itself against: foreignness, excess, a powerful woman directing a man's choices rather than the reverse. Here's the pattern worth sitting with, because it's still recognizable today. Just dressed in different cultural clothing. Societies very often punish relationships less for the actual harm they cause, and more for how visibly they cross a boundary the surrounding culture has decided matters. A relationship that quietly, privately violates someone's values rarely generates the kind of collective fury Antony and Cleopatra's relationship did. What generates that fury is a relationship that publicly, visibly, unapologetically rejects the script a culture has written for how people like you are supposed to live. This is exactly the territory Carlos and Rosa eventually had to navigate in their own, much smaller way. Not a clash between Rome and Egypt, but a quieter, no less real clash between the script their families had written for what a good marriage looked like, full of constant extended family involvement, and the script Rosa was trying carefully to write instead, one with more autonomy, more privacy, more space for just the two of them to decide things together first. Carlos and Rosa married young, both from large, tightly knit families in a working-class neighborhood in San Antonio, where extended relatives were deeply, constantly involved in every major life decision. For the first several years, that involvement felt like a gift. Built-in childcare, Sunday dinners that filled their tiny apartment with noise and food and love, a sense of never being alone in the hard early years of marriage. But as the marriage matured, Rosa began to want something her own mother and Carlos's mother both seemed to find faintly threatening: more autonomy as a couple, more decisions made just between the two of them, less constant input from two families who each, in their own way, believed they understood the marriage better than the people actually living inside it. When Rosa tried to gently establish boundaries, fewer unannounced visits, decisions about their own children made privately before being announced to the extended family. Both families read it not as healthy boundary setting, but as Rosa pulling Carlos away from his roots. Carlos, caught directly between his wife and his mother, did what many people in his position do. He started managing the conflict instead of resolving it. He'd quietly agree with Rosa in private, then quietly defer to his mother in public, telling himself he was keeping the peace, when what he was actually doing was avoiding the harder, more honest conversation that needed to happen with both sides. Conflict avoided doesn't disappear. It just moves underground, where it grows more dangerous, precisely because nobody's addressing it directly anymore. By the time Carlos and Rosa finally sat down with a counselor, 6 years into the marriage, both of them were exhausted in a way that had very little to do with each other, and everything to do with years of unresolved pressure neither of them had ever properly named out loud. What ultimately saved their marriage wasn't choosing one family's version of events over the others. It was Carlos finally taking an outside perspective seriously enough to examine it honestly, admitting painfully that some of what his mother was reacting to wasn't really about Rosa at all. It was about his own difficulty separating from his family of origin, a pattern that had nothing to do with his wife and everything to do with himself. What ultimately helped Carlos and Rosa wasn't choosing one culture's script over the other entirely. It was sitting down together and consciously deciding which elements of each inherited script actually served their marriage, and which they were simply following out of guilt, rather than genuine desire. They kept the Sunday dinners. Both of them genuinely loved that tradition. They didn't keep the unannounced visits, or the expectation that every major decision be run past both families before the couple themselves had even discussed it privately. This distinction matters, because it's exactly the distinction Antony and Cleopatra never got the chance, or perhaps never had the clarity to make. They didn't carefully sort through which elements of Roman tradition and Egyptian tradition genuinely served the partnership they were building, versus which they were rejecting or adopting purely out of rebellion, romance, or the simple gravitational pull of loving someone from a different world. By the end, their relationship had become less a careful synthesis of two civilizations, and more a wholesale departure from one of them. And departures that total, that visible, rarely survive contact with the world they're leaving behind. The officer who tried to warn him, Antony and Cleopatra, were never allowed to simply be two people falling in love. From the moment it became public, their relationship was read, interpreted, and ultimately weaponized as a statement about Rome's relationship to the East, about masculinity, about power, about civilization itself. They were never given the private space most couples need to work out their own dysfunction quietly, on their own terms, without an empire watching and waiting for an excuse to intervene. This doesn't excuse every choice Antony made, and it doesn't erase the genuine, well-founded concerns his own officers raised about his judgment, but it adds a dimension to this story that the simple great man corrupted by a seductress narrative has erased for 2,000 years. Antony and Cleopatra weren't simply failing at love, they were failing at love under conditions of scrutiny and existential stakes that almost no relationship in human history has ever had to survive. There's a man inside Antony's own camp in the months leading up to the war whose name barely survives in the historical record, but whose role in this story matters more than almost anyone realizes. Quintus Dellius, a Roman officer who had served under Antony for years, who had been with him through Alexandria, through the years of excess, through the slow drift away from Rome. By the winter before Actium, Dellius had started to see something the rest of Antony's inner circle either couldn't see or refused to say out loud. He saw Cleopatra's growing influence over military decisions that increasingly favored the naval strategy that played to Egypt's strengths rather than the land warfare Antony's legions were built for. Alienating Antony's own Roman officers, many of whom had served him loyally for 2 decades. He watched veteran commanders quietly request transfers. He heard the language used to talk about Antony, even among his own men, starting to shift from "our general" to something closer to "her general." Dellius eventually defected to Octavian, taking with him detailed knowledge of Antony's battle plans. But before he left, sources suggest he tried more than once to warn Antony directly, to tell him that the relationship everyone could see plainly from the outside. A Roman commander who had reorganized his entire military strategy and his entire identity around a foreign queen was a story Rome would never accept under any circumstances, no matter how the battle turned out. Antony heard him and dismissed it, not because the warning lacked evidence, but because it came from outside the only frame of reference that still felt real to him. This is the same echo chamber that took root in Alexandria years earlier, now closing over military judgment itself. The private world's own logic, quietly overruling the counsel of a man who had earned the right to be heard. Pay attention to this part, because it's about to become important later. The warning Dellius gave Antony wasn't really about military strategy at all. Underneath the surface, it was about identity. A quiet accusation that Antony had stopped being a Roman general who happened to love a queen, and had become something Rome would never recognize as one of its own. A queen's consort wearing a general's uniform. That accusation is going to come back later in this story, in a moment we haven't reached yet. Hold on to it. Antony never properly answered it. Not to Dellius, not to himself. One of Antony's oldest Roman friends, a senator named Munatius Plancus, spent considerable time in Antony's court during this same period, genuinely trying to maintain his friendship with Antony, while growing increasingly uneasy about what he witnessed there. The scale of Cleopatra's influence over military planning, the casual displays of wealth in excess, the way Antony's old Roman bluntness had been replaced by something more performative, more theatrical, more attuned to impressing a foreign court than commanding Roman soldiers. Plancus eventually defected to Octavian as well, just as Dellius had, and his testimony became some of the most damaging material in Octavian's propaganda campaign, including, according to several ancient sources, details from Antony's private will, which Plancus had witnessed, and which confirmed many of Rome's worst fears about Antony's intentions to divide Roman territory among his children with Cleopatra. It would be easy to read Plancus and Dellius simply as opportunists switching sides when the political winds shifted in Octavian's favor. And there was certainly self-interest involved. But the historical record also suggests something more complicated, and in a way more useful for understanding this entire story. These were men who had loved and respected Antony for decades, who tried, in their own limited and ultimately failed ways, to reach him before they gave up and left. Their defection wasn't simply betrayal. It was, in part, the final stage of a much longer process. The slow exhaustion that happens when people who genuinely care about someone try repeatedly to offer honest perspective, get quietly dismissed or absorbed into the relationship's own internal logic each time, and eventually conclude there's nothing left to do but step away. This is worth naming directly, because it's a warning sign worth recognizing in your own life long before it reaches the scale it reached for Antony. When the people who knew you longest, who loved you before your current relationship existed, start drifting away, not through dramatic conflict, but through a slow, quiet exhaustion at never being heard. That drift is rarely random. It's very often the visible symptom of exactly the kind of fusion and isolation we've been tracing throughout this story. And by the time those old friends have fully stepped back, a relationship has usually already lost one of its last remaining sources of outside perspective, at precisely the moment that perspective was needed most. A modern couples counselor, reflecting on patterns she's observed across decades of practice, has described watching this exact dynamic play out in dozens of marriages and long-term relationships brought into her office in crisis. The couples, who arrive early, while the relationship still has friends, family, and outside perspective actively engaged, tend to have dramatically better odds of genuine repair. Couples who arrive only after years of total isolation, after every honest outside voice has already given up and stepped back, face a much harder, much longer road. Not because the underlying problems are necessarily worse, but because the relationship has lost every external check that might have caught the problems earlier, while they were still small enough to address directly. By the time Antony stood on the deck of his flagship at Actium, watching Cleopatra's ships turn south, there was almost no one left around him who had known him before any of this. No Dellius, no Plancus, nobody with enough history and enough independent standing to grab him by the shoulders and ask, with the bluntness only an old friend can use, what exactly he thought he was doing. The isolation that made his final fatal decision possible hadn't happened in a single moment. It had been accumulating, friend by friend, departure by departure, for years, the letter that never quite arrived. Somewhere in these final months before Actium, letters circulated among Antony's officers, their exact author lost to history, though tradition attributes one to a senator sympathetic to Octavian's cause. accusing Antony in language designed to wound, of having become a queen's wife rather than a Roman husband. The letter never reached Antony directly, but its substance did, filtered through officers who whispered about it, through soldiers who'd started to wonder quietly exactly whose war they were actually fighting. Antony heard the accusation in fragments, secondhand, the way the worst wounds often arrive, and he never addressed it, not with Cleopatra, not with his officers, not with himself. We're going to come back to that exact accusation later, at a moment when Antony finally, painfully, has no choice but to face it directly. Hold on to it. There's one piece of research worth bringing in here, because it offers the clearest possible explanation for why Antony, by this point, was no longer capable of hearing warnings the way he might have a decade earlier. The psychologist Robert Cialdini's research on commitment and consistency demonstrates something almost universal about human decision-making. Once a person has invested heavily in a course of action, financially, socially, emotionally, they become powerfully motivated to interpret new information in ways that justify the investment already made, rather than ways that might suggest changing course. The bigger the investment, the stronger the pull. By 31 BC, Antony had invested everything: his marriage to Octavia, his standing in Rome, his relationship with Octavian, an entire decade of his life, into a future built with Cleopatra. Every warning he received now wasn't simply weighed on its own merits. It was weighed against the unbearable alternative of admitting that a decade of accumulating choices might have led him somewhere indefensible. And the human mind, faced with that choice, will very often choose almost anything: denial, rationalization, simply not listening, over the gutting work of admitting a sustained, years-long mistake. This is worth sitting with, because it's not really a story about Antony specifically. It's a story about anyone who has ever stayed in a relationship, a career, a decision, for years past the point where the original reasoning still held up, simply because turning back felt more unbearable than continuing forward, even when continuing forward was clearly, visibly leading somewhere worse. What the children carried. There's one more dimension of this story worth adding before we move into the battle itself. The effect of all of this on the 6 children scattered across this relationship's wreckage. Because their experience offers a clear window into a pattern that echoes into countless modern families built around relationships in crisis. By the time of the donations of Alexandria, Antony had fathered children across 3 different relationships: 2 daughters with Octavia, 3 children with Cleopatra, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, plus a younger son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, and Cleopatra's older son, Caesarion, from her relationship with Julius Caesar. 6 children, 3 mothers, 2 empires, all of it converging on a handful of young lives that none of them had any say in shaping. The twins were given names dripping with cosmic ambition even as infants. Helios meaning sun, Selene meaning moon, a deliberate symbolic statement about the scale of dominion Antony and Cleopatra imagined for their children's futures. At the donations of Alexandria, a 6-year-old Alexander Helios was dressed in Persian royal garments, and granted, on paper, vast eastern territories he would never actually rule. His twin sister was granted Cyrenaica and parts of Libya with equal ceremonial grandeur. These were small children, paraded in elaborate costume in front of a watching empire, carrying political weight neither of them could remotely comprehend. Here's the part worth sitting with. Because it's a pattern grief and family therapists see constantly in modern relationships built around intense, all-consuming adult drama. Children raised inside a relationship defined primarily by crisis, ambition, and constant external threat very often become, without anyone explicitly deciding it should be this way, extensions of their parents' shared narrative, rather than fully separate individuals being raised with their own independent needs centered. Alexander Helios wasn't simply a child in this story. He was a symbol, a piece in a political vision, dressed and named and positioned according to what his parents' relationship needed him to represent. This isn't unique to ancient royalty. Family therapists describe a remarkably similar dynamic in modern families, organized around a parent's all-consuming career ambition, a prolonged custody battle, or an intense, unstable romantic relationship that dominates a household's emotional weather. Children in these households often develop what therapists sometimes call parentification in reverse. Not literally caring for a parent's practical needs, the way classic parentification usually describes, but absorbing and managing the emotional weight of the parent's relationship drama. Learning to read tension in a room before they're old enough to understand what they're reading, becoming fluent in a kind of vigilance that should never have been asked of a child in the first place. Actium. The fleets met at Actium on the 2nd of September 31 BC. The battle should never have been close. On paper, Antony and Cleopatra commanded the larger force, 500 ships against Octavian's roughly 400. More than 100,000 soldiers against a smaller, leaner army under the brilliant young Admiral Agrippa. But numbers on paper, in war as in marriage, rarely tell you the whole story. What they don't show you is morale. They don't show you a fighting force whose own officers had started quietly to wonder whose cause they were actually dying for. By the morning of September 2nd, disease had already torn through Antony's camp during a brutal summer of waiting, weakening his forces substantially. Desertions had been steadily bleeding away experienced commanders for months. Dellius was only one of several officers who had slipped away to Octavian's side, taking strategic knowledge with them. And Antony, against the advice of several of his own remaining generals, had made a decision historians still debate today. Rather than fighting primarily on land, where his legions had the clearer advantage, he chose to commit to a naval engagement, a decision many ancient sources attribute directly to Cleopatra's influence, since Egypt's resources and the bulk of the available fleet favored a sea battle. Here's the part most retellings of this battle skip entirely, because it complicates the clean narrative people prefer. We don't actually know with certainty that Cleopatra forced this strategy on Antony against his better judgment. What we know is that, by this point in their relationship, untangling whose judgment was whose had become functionally impossible, for them and for everyone watching from the outside. The battle itself, when it finally came, was strange and anticlimactic in a way that has puzzled historians for 2,000 years. The two fleets engaged in the late morning, ships ramming and grappling in the waters off the western coast of Greece, the air filling with the sounds of splintering wood and burning pitch. Then, in the middle of the fighting, Cleopatra's 60 ships, including the treasury ship carrying the bulk of Egypt's gold, turned and sailed south, away from the battle entirely, catching a favorable wind and making for open water. Antony, watching this from his own flagship, made a decision that has defined his legacy ever since. He left his own fleet, still actively fighting, climbed aboard a smaller vessel and followed her. Stay with me here, because this is the moment the entire 2,000-year-old story turns on, and almost everyone gets the emotional truth of it wrong. The popular version treats it as romantic. A man so consumed by love that he abandoned an empire to chase the woman he couldn't live without. The crueler version treats it as proof of weakness. A once great general who simply couldn't function without a woman's approval. Both versions miss what was actually happening psychologically inside Antony in that exact moment. This is identity fusion taken to its furthest extreme. By this point, Antony's sense of who he was had become so entangled with Cleopatra that watching her ship sail away didn't simply feel like watching an ally retreat. It felt, to whatever was left of his own independent judgment, like watching a part of himself disappear over the horizon. He didn't choose Cleopatra over his army in some clean, conscious, romantic sense. He followed the only thing that still felt like solid ground amid total chaos, because somewhere along the years in Alexandria, he had stopped being able to locate solid ground anywhere else. His fleet, leaderless and confused, fought on for several more hours before finally surrendering. His land army, camped nearby and waiting for orders that never properly came, defected to Octavian within days, almost entirely without a fight. In the space of a single afternoon, Mark Antony lost the war for Rome, Diane, and the muscles that atrophies. Let's pause here, because this is exactly the moment to bring in Diane, 55 years old, married 30 years, living in a quiet suburb of Atlanta. Her story illuminates something about Antony's decision at Actium that no amount of military history ever quite captures. Diane married at 25 to a man who was, by her own later admission, never cruel, never violent, but quietly and persistently diminishing in 1,000 small ways she didn't have language for until decades later. He made decisions for both of them without asking. He dismissed her opinions in front of friends, gently enough that nobody else noticed, but precisely enough that Diane noticed every single time. Over 30 years, Diane's own sense of what she wanted, what she believed, what she was even capable of, slowly eroded, replaced almost entirely by his preferences, his opinions, his version of their shared life. When her youngest child finally left for college, Diane sat in an empty house and realized, with a kind of vertigo she'd never experienced before, that she genuinely did not know what she wanted for dinner, without first considering what her husband would prefer. 30 years of accommodation hadn't simply shaped her marriage. It had reshaped her actual capacity for independent judgment. A therapist she eventually saw described what had happened to Diane using language that applies with eerie precision to Antony on that ship, watching Cleopatra's fleet disappear over the horizon. When a person spends years or decades consistently deferring their judgment to someone else's, the part of the brain responsible for independent decision-making doesn't simply go dormant. It atrophies, the way an unused muscle does. And the frightening part isn't the years of deference themselves, it's the moment, often arriving suddenly and without warning, when independent judgment is urgently needed again. A crisis, a confrontation, a single critical decision that has to be made alone, and the capacity simply isn't there anymore, because it hasn't been exercised in years. Antony at Actium, needed exactly that capacity at the single most consequential moment of his entire life. And it wasn't there. Not because he was a coward, not because he loved Cleopatra too much in some simple romantic sense, but because years of identity fusion had quietly hollowed out the independent decision-making muscle that moment absolutely required. In its absence, he did the only thing that still felt like instinct. He followed the person his entire sense of self had become anchored to. Diane's recovery from 30 years of that pattern took nearly 5 years of therapy, much of it spent doing something that sounds almost absurdly simple but was, she says, the hardest work of her life, practicing making small decisions entirely on her own, without consulting anyone, and sitting with the discomfort of that independence until it stopped feeling unbearable and started feeling, slowly, like her own mind belonged to her again. Antony never got 5 years. From this point forward, he had less than 1. The accusation finally faced. Here's the part most people skip when they tell this story, eager to rush toward the famous ending. What happened in the months immediately after Actium, when Antony, humiliated and reeling, finally had to reckon, however briefly, with the accusation that had been circulating in fragments through his camp for months. We need to go back to Octavia for a moment, because what happened next involves her directly, and it's the moment the small open loop planted earlier in this story finally resolves. In the chaos following Actium, with Antony's political and military position collapsing rapidly, several of his remaining allies in Rome made one final attempt at reconciliation, some urging Antony to formally divorce Octavia in a way that might actually calm Roman anger, others, in a more desperate version of the same idea, urging him to return to her entirely, to publicly recommit to his Roman marriage, as a way of salvaging some shred of legitimacy before Octavian's forces arrived to finish what Actium had started. Antony chose neither path cleanly. Historical sources suggest he sent Octavia formal notice of divorce shortly after Actium, a brutal, almost businesslike end to a marriage that had once represented genuine peace between two warring factions of Rome. Yet in the desperate weeks immediately following the battle, there's evidence Antony considered, even if only briefly, attempting some kind of reconciliation, weighing whether there was still a version of his life where he returned to Rome, returned to Octavia, returned to being the man he had been before Alexandria. It's in this exact window, alone, humiliated, his army gone, his fleet destroyed, that the accusation planted earlier in this story finally catches up to him. The senator's letter. The whispered phrase passed through his officers in the months before the battle. A queen's wife, not a Roman husband. sitting with the wreckage of everything he had built. Antony finally had to face that accusation directly, without the noise of war or politics to distract him from it. Here's what makes this moment genuinely tragic rather than simply pathetic. By every account of his behavior in these weeks, Antony didn't reject the accusation. He didn't insist it was unfair, or untrue, or born of jealousy and propaganda. He appears in his darkest private moments after Actium to have simply absorbed it, to have looked honestly, perhaps for the first time in a decade, at exactly how far he had drifted from the man he used to be, and found that he could no longer mount a defense against the charge, even to himself. This is the part that connects most powerfully to everyone watching this who has ever lived inside a relationship that slowly, gradually reshaped them into someone they no longer fully recognized. The accusation that finally breaks through the bubble almost never arrives as a surprise. It arrives as a confirmation of something you'd already quietly started to suspect about yourself, and had simply never had the stillness or the courage to examine directly, until the rest of your life forced you to stop running. Antony did not return to Octavia. He did not return to Rome. Whatever brief window existed for that kind of reconciliation closed within weeks, as Octavian's forces began moving toward Egypt itself, with nowhere else to go, and no version of his old life left to return to. Antony sailed back to Alexandria, to the only person and the only world that still recognized him as who he had become. Here's the part most couples never get told plainly enough, and it matters enormously for understanding everything that happens in the final act of this story. There is a real difference between a relationship that has gone wrong because two people made a mistake they can still recover from, and a relationship that has become the only remaining structure holding a person's entire identity together. Antony, by the winter following Actium, was no longer choosing Cleopatra in any meaningful sense, the way he might have chosen her freely a decade earlier. He had nowhere else left to be. The choice had quietly stopped being a choice at all. Two things being true at once, by the time Octavian's army reached the walls of Alexandria. In the summer of 30 BC, Mark Antony had almost nothing left of what he'd once commanded. A handful of loyal ships, a diminished, exhausted force, a handful of officers who hadn't yet defected, staying now less out of strategic confidence and more out of personal loyalty to a man they'd followed for 20 years and couldn't quite bring themselves to abandon at the very end. Cleopatra, meanwhile, was doing what she had always done best in moments of existential crisis, calculating, negotiating, searching for any remaining angle that might preserve her throne and her children's futures, even as the walls of her own city closed in. According to several ancient sources, she opened secret negotiations with Octavian during this period, attempting to secure terms that would let her keep Egypt, or at minimum protect her children's lives, separate from whatever fate awaited Antony. Here's the part most retellings of this story handle clumsily because it's genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. Cleopatra's final weeks appear to have been simultaneously devoted to Antony and actively negotiating a path forward that might not include him. Both things were true at once. And if that feels contradictory to you, watching from 2,000 years away, it's worth pausing on why it feels contradictory. Most of us have been taught to believe that real love means a single, uncomplicated, all-or-nothing devotion, with no room for self-preservation running alongside it. But psychologists who study how people behave under existential threat will tell you something that complicates the romantic mythology around this entire story. Love and self-preservation are not actually opposites, and a person navigating both simultaneously isn't necessarily betraying the relationship. Cleopatra was a queen, a mother of 4 children, whose lives depended entirely on decisions she made in these final weeks, and a woman who had genuinely loved Antony for over a decade. None of those identities canceled out the others. She was holding all three at once, in a situation almost nobody watching this will ever have to face. Judging her purely through the lens of romantic loyalty, as so many retellings of this story do, flattens a far more complicated, far more human reality. Picture a woman we'll call Nicole, 40, going through the final stages of an unwanted divorce. Nicole's husband had decided, after 18 years of marriage, that he wanted out. Not because of betrayal, not because of any single dramatic failure, but because of a slow accumulation of dissatisfaction he'd never fully voiced until he'd already made up his mind to leave. Nicole spent the final months of that marriage in a state most divorce therapists recognize immediately, genuinely still loving the man she was married to, while simultaneously beginning to build a separate financial and emotional plan for a future without him. Friends and family watching from the outside sometimes struggled to understand how Nicole could be devastated by the marriage ending, while also, in the same week, meeting with a lawyer to protect her share of the house. It looked to some of them like she wasn't really that broken up about it. What was actually happening was something far more universal and far more dignified. Nicole was doing exactly what any psychologically healthy person does when facing the end of something they love, grieving and adapting at the same time. Human beings are capable of holding contradictory emotional realities simultaneously, and a person who can do both at once isn't loving any less. They're surviving more intelligently. This is worth understanding before we watch what happens next, because Cleopatra's final negotiations with Octavian have been read for 2,000 years as evidence of coldness, of calculation, of a queen who was never really in love with Antony at all and was simply using him the entire time. The far more likely truth, the one modern psychology actually supports, is that Cleopatra was doing precisely what Nicole did, loving fully, while also doing the necessary work of protecting herself and her children from a catastrophe that was no longer avoidable. There's a piece of Cleopatra's final negotiations worth adding here, because it deepens something important about her psychology in those last weeks. According to several ancient accounts, she tried to secure a guarantee specifically for her children, particularly for Caesarion, whose claim as Julius Caesar's biological son represented the single greatest threat to Octavian's own legitimacy as Caesar's adopted heir. She is recorded as having offered Octavian enormous sums from her remaining treasury, attempting essentially to purchase her children's safety, even if her own fate and Antony's remained uncertain. Octavian, by every account, gave her vague, non-committal assurances designed to keep her cooperative and calm during the final negotiations. Assurances he had no genuine intention of honoring. She likely knew by the time she made her final decision, that her negotiating position was far weaker than Octavian was allowing her to believe. Her own intelligence network, the same sharp political instincts that had kept her alive since childhood, would have given her ample reason to doubt his promises. And yet she continued negotiating anyway, trying every available angle right up until the moment she finally accepted that no angle remained. This connects to a pattern grief counselors and crisis psychologists recognize clearly in people facing genuinely hopeless circumstances. Continuing to fight, continuing to search for an exit even when the rational mind has already concluded no exit exists, isn't denial in the pathological sense. It's often something closer to a final act of love and responsibility, refusing to abandon the people depending on you until every possible option has been genuinely exhausted, even when exhausting those options offers little realistic hope of success. A woman named Patricia, facing a terminal diagnosis at 58, with 2 adult children and a husband of 30 years, described to her hospice counselor doing something remarkably similar to what Cleopatra appears to have done in her final weeks, continuing to research experimental treatments, continuing to call specialists, not because she genuinely believed a cure was coming, but because she needed her family to see her fighting until the very end. To know without any ambiguity that she hadn't simply given up on them. I wasn't fighting for myself anymore by the end, Patricia told her counselor. I was fighting so my kids would know I never stopped trying to stay for them. This is perhaps the most overlooked dimension of Cleopatra's final weeks. Not simply a queen calculating her own survival, and not simply a grieving lover destroyed by Antony's death, but a mother continuing to fight on behalf of children whose futures she could no longer fully control, until the moment that fight, too finally and completely ran out of road. The message that arrived too late. As negotiations between Cleopatra and Octavian continued in secret, word reached Antony, possibly true, possibly a piece of deliberate misinformation. Historians still debate which, that Cleopatra had died. We need to slow down here, because this is the moment that sets the final tragedy of this entire story into motion, and it deserves to be told carefully. The most widely accepted account, recorded by Plutarch generations later, suggests that Cleopatra, fearing Antony's reaction to her secret negotiations with Octavian, retreated to a mausoleum she had built for herself, sealed herself inside with her treasure and her most loyal attendants, and sent word to Antony that she had taken her own life. Whether this was a genuine attempt at suicide that failed, a desperate test of his loyalty, or simply a tactical retreat that got misreported in the chaos, we will likely never know for certain. What we do know is what Antony did when he received that message. He didn't hesitate. He didn't seek confirmation. In a city collapsing around him, having already lost his army, his empire, and nearly every ally he had once commanded, the news that Cleopatra was dead appears to have stripped away the very last thing holding him together. He turned to his servant, a man named Eros, and asked him to fulfill a promise Eros had apparently made years earlier, to kill Antony if it ever came to that, rather than let him be captured and humiliated by Octavian. Eros drew his sword, and then, rather than striking his master, turned the blade on himself, dying instantly at Antony's feet. A final devastating act of loyalty that left Antony alone, with no one left to do what he believed he needed done. So Antony did it himself. He drew his own sword and drove it into his stomach, a wound that by every surviving account was agonizing and slow and did not kill him outright. And it was in this state, bleeding, in unbearable pain, believing the woman he had loved for over a decade was already dead, that Antony received the actual truth. Cleopatra was alive. This moment should stop you completely, regardless of how many times you've heard some version of this ending before. Word reached Antony, somehow, in his final agonizing hours, that the report of Cleopatra's death had been wrong. She was alive, sealed inside her mausoleum, and she wanted him brought to her. Before we go there, I want to pause on something that connects directly to everyone watching this. This moment in Antony's life. The unbearable gap between believing someone you love is gone forever, and then learning, too late to undo what that belief already caused you to do, that they were alive the whole time, is one of the oldest and most universal sources of human anguish there is. Most of us, thankfully, will never face a version of it this literal, but almost everyone watching this has faced some smaller echo of it. A reaction made in the belief that something was already lost, a wall built around your heart because you assumed the worst had already happened, a relationship you gave up on one day too early, only to learn later that there had still been time. They carried him to her. Antony's men, knowing better than to attempt opening the sealed mausoleum doors with Octavian's forces close behind, instead hauled him up to a window using ropes and pulleys. Cleopatra and her two remaining attendants straining together to lift a dying man's full weight up the side of a building, inch by agonizing inch, while he bled the entire way up. According to Plutarch, Cleopatra wept and tore at her own clothing as she pulled him through the window, calling him by name. Once he was finally inside, laid across her lap, covered in blood, she held him and would not let go. Here, finally, is where the question from the very beginning of this story gets answered, though not in the way you might expect, and not with words at all. Antony, in his final minutes, did not ask Cleopatra to abandon her negotiations with Octavian. He did not ask her to die alongside him, or extract any final promise about loyalty or legacy. According to the most detailed surviving account, he told her instead to try to save herself if there was any way left to do it. Then, with whatever strength remained in him, he asked for wine, drank a little, and spoke briefly of his own past, the things he had once accomplished before everything that came after. And here, finally, is the answer to the question Cleopatra asked him on the night before Actium, the question we opened this entire story with. If you had to choose right now between me and Rome, what would you choose? He never could answer that question on that night, because by then the question itself no longer made sense. There was no longer a version of Antony that existed separately from his life with Cleopatra, capable of weighing one against the other like two items on a scale. The fusion had gone too deep, too far for too long. There was nothing left of the Antony who could choose by the time she asked him to. There was only the Antony who had already become this. A man whose entire remaining identity was built around the relationship itself, with no independent ground left to stand on and make the comparison from. This is the part no school will ever teach you. And it's the single most important psychological truth this entire story has to offer. The most devastating thing that can happen inside an intense, all-consuming love isn't betrayal, and it isn't loss. It's the slow, often invisible erosion of the self that existed before the relationship began, until the person you were before disappears so completely that even a direct, simple question about your own priorities becomes impossible to answer, because answering it would require a version of you that no longer exists. Antony died in Cleopatra's arms, in the upper chamber of her own mausoleum, with Octavian's forces only days away from taking the city entirely. The brain in withdrawal. Let's go back for a moment to the science that explains, in concrete, measurable terms, exactly how a brain gets to the place Antony's brain reached that final night. The anthropologist Helen Fisher has spent much of her career trying to understand exactly this question, using brain imaging studies on people in the early, intense stages of romantic love. What she found is worth understanding in detail, because it reframes almost everything we've covered so far. Fisher's research identified a specific neurochemical state she calls limerence, an intense, often involuntary form of romantic obsession characterized by elevated dopamine, the same neurotransmitter associated with the early stages of addiction, alongside reduced activity in the regions of the brain responsible for critical judgment and risk assessment. Fisher's brain scans of people in the early stages of intense romantic love look remarkably similar to brain scans of people in the early stages of cocaine addiction. The same reward pathways lighting up, the same diminished activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for weighing long-term consequences against short-term reward. Limerence isn't simply a metaphor when people say love makes you lose your mind. There is, according to Fisher's research, a real measurable neurological basis for exactly that experience. But limerence, by Fisher's own research, is not designed to last. Most studies on the duration of this intense neurochemical state suggest it typically runs somewhere between 18 months and 3 years before the brain, through a process not fully understood, begins shifting away from dopamine-driven obsession and toward a calmer, more stable bonding system built around different neurochemicals entirely, primarily oxytocin and vasopressin, the chemistry of long-term attachment rather than acute infatuation. Here's the question this raises about Antony and Cleopatra that almost no version of this story ever asks directly. Their relationship lasted over a decade. Limerence on its own cannot explain that kind of duration. Something else was happening, something that kept reactivating the intensity past the point where a typical relationship would have naturally settled into calmer, more stable attachment. Fisher's research offers a possible answer, and it's one of the most important ideas in this entire story. Intermittent, high-stakes uncertainty, the kind Antony and Cleopatra lived inside constantly, given the genuine political danger surrounding their entire relationship, appears to actually prolong the limerent state, sometimes for years beyond its typical duration. The brain's dopamine system, it turns out, responds even more powerfully to unpredictable, high-stakes reward than to predictable, safe reward. A relationship under constant external threat, constant uncertainty about whether tomorrow brings triumph or catastrophe, can functionally keep two people locked in something closer to the early, obsessive stage of love for years, even decades, because the nervous system never gets the chance to relax into the calmer architecture of stable attachment. This reframes the entire emotional arc of this story. Antony and Cleopatra weren't simply two people who fell deeply in love and stayed that way out of sheer devotion. They were two people whose relationship existed inside a near-constant state of existential threat. Wars, betrayals, the looming presence of Octavian, the perpetual uncertainty of whether their empire would survive another year, conditions that, according to Fisher's research, appear almost perfectly designed to keep a romantic relationship locked in its most intense, judgment-impairing neurochemical state for far longer than nature ever intended. Diane's recovery, the woman in Atlanta we met earlier, offers an unexpected confirmation of this same principle, viewed from the opposite direction. Diane's 30-year marriage wasn't built on crisis or uncertainty. It was built on stability and predictability. A relationship that, for all its dysfunction, never had the kind of existential stakes that kept Antony and Cleopatra's relationship locked in perpetual intensity. And it was precisely that stability, ironically, that allowed Diane's own independent judgment to atrophy so completely over 30 years. Without the periodic jolts of crisis that might have forced her sooner to confront what was actually happening to her sense of self. This is not a story about love being inherently dangerous, or about intensity always being a warning sign, or about Antony and Cleopatra being somehow uniquely weak compared to other couples. It's a story about what happens to any two human brains, regardless of how intelligent or capable the people attached to them are, when love is allowed to exist for years inside conditions of constant uncertainty and existential stakes, without ever being given the chance to settle into the calmer, more stable architecture that sustainable long-term love actually requires. This connects directly to research from John Gottman, whose decades-long studies of married couples at the Gottman Institute identified what he calls the 4 horsemen. 4 specific communication patterns that, when they appear consistently in a relationship, predict divorce with striking accuracy: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Gottman's research is built almost entirely on observing stable, long-term relationships under ordinary, day-to-day conditions, exactly the kind of relationship architecture Antony and Cleopatra's circumstances never allowed them to build. Here's what's genuinely fascinating and a little haunting, about applying Gottman's framework to this story. By most surviving accounts, Antony and Cleopatra's relationship doesn't actually show clear evidence of the 4 horsemen the way Gottman would recognize them. There's little record of contempt between them, little evidence of the kind of corrosive, day-to-day communication breakdown that predicts most modern divorces. What destroyed their relationship wasn't a failure of communication or daily intimacy in Gottman's specific sense. It was something his framework, built for ordinary marriages under ordinary conditions, was never designed to measure at all. The catastrophic external pressure of an empire actively working to tear 2 specific people apart, combined with an internal psychological erosion, neither partner had the tools or the perspective to recognize. While it was happening to them, this distinction matters enormously for anyone watching this and trying to apply lessons from Antony and Cleopatra's story to their own life. If your relationship is struggling because of patterns Gottman would recognize: contempt, stonewalling, the slow accumulation of resentment in ordinary daily life, the path forward looks like the kind of conscious daily relational work Gottman's research has spent decades documenting. But if your relationship is struggling because it has never been given the conditions to settle, because it exists, for whatever reason, inside a near-constant state of crisis or uncertainty, the work required looks different entirely. It looks less like communication skills and more like the deliberate, sometimes difficult project of building stability where chaos has lived for too long. There's one more piece of research worth bringing in here, because it offers a genuinely useful practical insight, grounded in modern data rather than ancient history and neuroscience theory alone. Researchers studying couples who form or strengthen their relationships under conditions of shared external crisis, wartime, natural disaster, serious illness, financial catastrophe, have found a consistent and somewhat counterintuitive pattern. These relationships often report higher initial satisfaction and faster, deeper bonding than relationships formed under ordinary circumstances. The shared adversity genuinely does accelerate intimacy, exactly the way Fisher's research on uncertainty and dopamine would predict. But longitudinal studies following these same couples for years afterward have found something more sobering. Relationships forged primarily under crisis conditions show meaningfully higher rates of breakdown once the crisis itself resolves, compared to relationships that had the chance to develop more gradually under stable conditions. Researchers have proposed a fairly intuitive explanation, one that applies directly to Antony and Cleopatra. Crisis-bonded couples often build a relationship optimized for crisis, communication patterns, emotional roles, and a shared sense of purpose specifically calibrated to surviving external threat. When the crisis ends, whether through resolution, relocation, or simply the passage of time, these couples frequently discover they never actually built the skills required for ordinary, low-stakes daily partnership. Because ordinary daily life was never the environment their relationship was originally built to handle. This research offers something genuinely useful for anyone whose own relationship began, or was deeply strengthened, during a period of shared crisis, a difficult diagnosis, a financial emergency, a family tragedy weathered together. It doesn't mean your relationship is doomed, but it does suggest something worth being intentional about. Actively, deliberately building the skills and rhythms of ordinary, uneventful partnership, rather than simply assuming the intensity that bonded you during crisis will automatically translate into the steadier architecture required once the crisis passes. Antony and Cleopatra never got the chance to test this for themselves under peaceful conditions. Their entire relationship, from the golden barge at Tarsus to the final days in the besieged mausoleum, existed almost continuously under some form of political crisis or existential threat. We will never know whether their particular partnership, given a genuine decade of ordinary peacetime stability, could have built the steadier architecture that crisis-forged relationships so often struggle to develop on their own. History never gave them, or us, the chance to find out. If your relationship was built primarily under fire, don't mistake the intensity of that bond for proof that the foundation is automatically solid. Build the boring skills too. The daily check-ins, the small repairs, the unglamorous rhythms of ordinary partnership, even, and especially, after the crisis that first brought you together has finally passed. Isolated together psychologists studying what's sometimes called folie à deux, literally, madness of two, describe a rare but well-documented phenomenon in which two people, through prolonged, intense, isolated proximity, gradually come to share and reinforce a single distorted view of reality that neither would have developed independently. It's most commonly studied in extreme clinical cases. Pairs of individuals isolated together who develop shared delusions neither would hold on their own, but milder versions of the same underlying mechanism show up far more broadly. Researchers note that in any sufficiently isolated, sufficiently intense relationship, two people who spend enough time together, reinforcing each other's perceptions without enough outside contact to check those perceptions against, can gradually construct a shared reality that drifts, sometimes substantially, from how the rest of the world actually sees the same situation. Antony and Cleopatra, by the final years of their relationship, were about as isolated from genuinely independent outside perspective as two of the most powerful people on earth could possibly be, surrounded by courtiers and officers whose own positions depended on staying in the couple's good graces, increasingly cut off from honest counsel from Rome, increasingly dismissive of the warnings that did reach them. Like Delius, like the senator's letter, they had constructed, between the two of them, an entire shared reality in which their vision of a blended Roman-Egyptian future seemed not just possible but inevitable. The donations of Alexandria weren't a miscalculation born of arrogance alone. They were the natural output of two minds that had spent over a decade reinforcing each other's perceptions, almost entirely insulated from the genuinely independent perspective that might have caught the miscalculation in time. The pattern of blame. Before we follow Cleopatra into the final hours of her life, it's worth pausing on a piece of historical context that grounds everything we've discussed so far in something larger than two individual people. How empires have always handled the women who threaten them. Throughout Roman history, in the decades before and after Cleopatra, the historical record shows a consistent pattern. Foreign queens, female rulers, and powerful women who challenged Roman political interests were almost universally remembered in surviving Roman sources through language emphasizing seduction, sexual manipulation, and moral corruption, rarely through language acknowledging political skill, military strategy, or genuine statecraft. Even when the actual record shows women, who were frequently more capable administrators and strategists than the men sent to oppose them. Cleopatra is simply the most famous example of an extremely consistent pattern. This matters for understanding something crucial about modern relationships too. Sociologists studying how betrayal and relationship breakdown get narrated even today have found a persistent gender asymmetry in how blame gets distributed in popular retelling, regardless of the actual facts of a given situation. Women who pursue powerful or already committed men are disproportionately cast, in casual cultural narrative, as the architects of the betrayal, temptresses, homewreckers, while the men involved are far more often granted the softer language of having been led astray, as though adult men exercise meaningfully less agency over their own choices than the women they're involved with. This isn't a minor cultural footnote. It's a pattern that actively shapes how millions of real people process their own real relationship crises. Megan, the woman from Denver whose husband had an affair, described years later how friends and even family members initially asked her, almost reflexively, what the other woman had done to go after her husband, before anyone asked what her husband had actually chosen, of his own free will, to do. Here's the principle worth carrying forward, both for understanding Cleopatra's legacy and for examining your own assumptions about relationship breakdowns you may have witnessed in your own life. Every adult in a relationship triangle, in ancient Alexandria or modern Denver, possesses genuine agency. Holding that truth doesn't require ignoring real power differentials or genuine harm, but it does require resisting the much older, much more comfortable cultural habit of locating the entire moral weight of a broken relationship in whichever participant is easiest to cast as the outsider, rather than examining honestly the choices made by everyone actually involved. Cleopatra has carried that cultural weight for 2,000 years. Its worth, in these final moments of her story, setting it down and looking instead at what the actual historical record tells us about the woman who was about to make the final decision of her life. A death, written on her own terms. Octavian, having captured Cleopatra alive, made his intentions increasingly clear over the following days. She would be taken to Rome and displayed publicly in his triumphal procession, the ultimate symbol of his victory over the East. Paraded through the streets in chains for the entertainment of the very city that had spent a decade being told she was a monster. Cleopatra had survived, by this point in her life, palace coups, a civil war, the assassination of one lover, and the catastrophic downfall of another, and threats from her own siblings that began when she was barely out of childhood. She understood, with the same clear-eyed calculation that had defined every major decision of her life, exactly what kind of death awaited her dignity, even if her body survived the journey to Rome. She made her decision in her final hours according to Plutarch's account, the most detailed surviving source, though written more than a century after her death, and almost certainly shaped to some degree by Roman cultural assumptions about how a defeated foreign queen ought to behave. Cleopatra requested a final, lavish meal, dressed herself in her full royal regalia, and arranged to have a basket of figs brought to her sealed chamber, smuggled past Octavian's guards. Hidden among the figs, according to the most widely accepted version of events, was an asp, an Egyptian cobra, an animal closely associated in Egyptian religious tradition with royalty and divinity, sometimes interpreted as granting a form of immortality to those it killed. She was found dead shortly after, along with two of her most loyal attendants, who appear to have chosen to die alongside her, rather than survive to face Octavian's custody without her. Here's what almost every popular retelling of this moment gets wrong, and it's worth correcting plainly, because it changes the entire emotional register of how this death should actually be understood. This was not, by any reasonable reading of the available evidence, a woman destroyed by grief, collapsing under the unbearable weight of losing the man she loved. This was, by every indication available to us, a final, deliberate, carefully staged act of agency by a woman who had spent her entire life fighting with everything available to her to control her own fate, choosing, in her last possible moment of genuine choice, exactly how her story would end, on her own terms, in her own royal dress, surrounded by symbols of the divinity and sovereignty Rome. was about to strip from her forever. Psychologists who study post-traumatic growth own, and its darker counterpart, what researchers call narrative control in the face of inevitable loss, describe something that applies with real precision to Cleopatra's final choice. When people facing an unavoidable, catastrophic outcome are stripped of the ability to change that outcome itself, they very often direct enormous psychological energy toward the one thing that remains within their control: the manner, the meaning, and the story attached to how that outcome unfolds. Cleopatra could not save her kingdom. She could not save Antony. She likely could not even save her own life from Octavian's intentions. But she could, and did, control exactly how the final chapter of her story would be told, choosing death by her own hand, in her own regalia, framed within her own civilization's most sacred symbols of royal divinity, rather than allowing Octavian to write that final chapter for her in chains on the streets of Rome. This is worth holding on to deeply as we move toward the close of this story, because it reframes everything about how Cleopatra's death has been understood for 2,000 years. It was never simply the final act of a tragic romance. It was the final act of a woman who had spent her entire life refusing to let anyone else write her story, choosing, in her absolute last possible moment of agency, to keep that refusal intact until the very end. Cleopatra died on the 12th of August 30 BC, by most historians reckoning just days after Antony. In the immediate aftermath, Octavian, now the undisputed master of the entire Roman world, soon to be renamed Augustus and to rule as Rome's first emperor for over 4 decades, had Caesarion, Cleopatra's son with Julius Caesar, hunted down and executed, removing the one remaining rival claim to Caesar's legacy. Cleopatra and Antony's 3 children together were spared, taken to Rome, and raised in Octavia's own household. Octavia, the wife Antony had abandoned, a woman who had been publicly humiliated by their relationship for over a decade, personally raising the children her husband had, with the woman who took him from her. Sit with that for a moment, because it's one of the most quietly remarkable details in this entire story, and it almost never gets the attention it deserves. Octavia, who had every reason in the world to resent those children, who could easily have allowed them to be cast aside or worse in the political chaos following their parents' deaths, chose instead to raise them as her own. History records no evidence of cruelty toward them. If anything, the record suggests she treated them with genuine care. Here's what that detail reveals, and it's worth holding on to as we move toward the final lessons of this story. Dignity in the aftermath of devastating betrayal doesn't always look like the cathartic confrontation popular storytelling usually offers. Sometimes it looks exactly like what Octavia did, quietly, choosing to be larger than the worst thing that ever happened to you, not because the person who hurt you deserved that grace, but because you decided, independently, what kind of person you were going to remain afterward, regardless of what had been done to you. After Antony and Cleopatra's deaths, the surviving children's fates diverged in their own particular ways. The twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and their younger brother, Ptolemy Philadelphus, grew up in Octavia's household alongside her own children from both her marriages. Cleopatra Selene in particular was eventually married to Jubasikin, a Roman-educated North African king, in a union that by most historical accounts became a successful, stable partnership in its own right, built remarkably on the kind of mutual intellectual partnership and shared governance that echoed her own mother's strengths, without inheriting the catastrophic instability that ultimately destroyed her parents. Patterns repeat across generations, but they are never inevitable. Cleopatra Selene grew up carrying an extraordinary, complicated inheritance, a mother who'd nearly toppled an empire through total relational fusion, and a father broken by the same pattern, a childhood spent partly as a political symbol in a doomed dynastic vision. And yet, by every available account, she went on to build something genuinely different, a marriage characterized by partnership rather than fusion, by mutual respect rather than mutual obsession, by the kind of stable, sustainable architecture her own parents never managed to construct. If there's a quiet hope buried inside this entire tragic story, it's there, in the next generation. Proof that the patterns we inherit from the relationships that raised us are real and worth understanding honestly. But they are never the only possible ending available to us. The body that didn't know yet. There's one more piece of Fisher's research worth bringing in, because it explains something else about that final night. Not why Antony followed Cleopatra's ship at Actium, but why the mere report of her death was enough to make him fall on his own sword before he'd even confirmed it was true. In later stages of her career, Fisher turned her attention from the early stages of love to what happens in a brain that has lost a deep attachment. Her team scanned the brains of people who had recently experienced romantic rejection or loss, people who described themselves as still deeply in love with someone they could no longer be with. And what they found was striking. The same reward pathways that lit up during the height of romantic love didn't simply go dark when the relationship ended. They kept firing, sometimes even more intensely than during the relationship itself, in a pattern that looked less like sadness and more like craving. A system in withdrawal from a substance it had organized itself around, still sending signals demanding something no longer available to give. This explains something genuinely important about grief that the standard vocabulary of heartbreak never quite captures. The longing people feel after losing a long-term partner isn't simply the emotional absence of someone they loved. It's a neurological system, built synapse by synapse, around the presence of a specific person, suddenly firing into nothing, still expecting the input it was designed to receive. Still generating the chemistry of anticipation and reward with nowhere for any of it to go. Fisher's team identified a specific region of the brain that remained active during this withdrawal phase. The ventral tegmental area, the same deep midbrain structure responsible for generating dopamine during the early obsessive stages of romantic love. In a functioning relationship, this region is constantly fed by the presence of the partner. Conversations, physical contact, shared laughter, even the simple anticipation of seeing someone later that day. Remove all of that input suddenly, and the region doesn't simply adjust, it escalates, generating more craving, more seeking behavior, the same neurological urgency that in the context of a living relationship feels like love, and in the context of loss feels like a particular kind of torment. Antony's behavior in the hours after he believed Cleopatra was dead, the immediate panic, the total collapse of any instinct for self-preservation, makes a great deal more sense in this context than either the romantic mythology or the military historical criticism usually allows for. He wasn't simply overwhelmed by grief in the ordinary sense. He was, by this point in their relationship, almost certainly in full neurological withdrawal from a decade-long attachment, his midbrain firing signals of craving and seeking into a void that had, as far as he knew, just become permanent. In that state, independent judgment doesn't simply diminish. Research on acute grief and romantic loss suggests it can become briefly, functionally unavailable, exactly as it appeared to be in that tent in Alexandria. There's a woman worth mentioning here, named Ellen, 51, who lost her husband of 23 years to a sudden cardiac event at home, with no warning, no illness, no preparation of any kind. Ellen described the weeks immediately following his death as feeling, physically, like being in a body that didn't understand yet what had happened. A body that kept generating anticipatory signals toward a person who was no longer there to receive them. She would reach for her phone to text him about something she'd seen. She would turn automatically to say something to him, in rooms he would never be in again. Her own nervous system, organized for 23 years around his specific presence, insisting in 1,000 small physical impulses that he was still coming back. The grief counselor kept trying to help me with my feelings, Ellen said in an interview conducted as part of a study on spousal bereavement. But it wasn't really my feelings that needed the help in those first months. It was my body. My body didn't know yet. My body was still waiting. This is perhaps the most human and the most scientifically precise way to understand the final hours of Antony's life. Not as a man making a choice, but as a nervous system receiving a signal it had no capacity to survive. The centuries of judgment that followed, the accusations of weakness and romantic foolishness, the propaganda that cast him as a man undone by a woman's power, all missed what Fisher's research, 2,000 years later, would finally be able to describe in neurological terms. He wasn't weak, he was wired. What happened in that tent was less a failure of character, and more the terminal output of a decade's worth of neurological architecture, suddenly asked to function without the input it had been built around. Ellen spent nearly 3 years in a grief support group, doing the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding the independent neural pathways that had been organized for 23 years around another person's presence. She describes the process now as less like healing from a wound, and more like learning, in middle age, to stand differently, rebalancing a body that had spent decades leaning naturally and lovingly in a direction that was no longer there. "I'm not the same as I was before him," she said in a follow-up interview. "I don't think I could be even if I wanted to. But I'm whole again, just a different shape of whole than I used to be." That's the ending this story doesn't get. Antony never had 3 years, or a grief support group, or the kind of unhurried space in which a nervous system can slowly, painfully reorganize itself around its own center rather than someone else's. He had hours, and in hours, the neurological architecture of a decade had nowhere to go but the direction it had always pointed. Even in the dark, even in the wrong direction, even with a sword already in hand, the relationship that belonged to everyone watching. There's a dimension of Antony and Cleopatra's relationship that almost no modern retelling spends real time on, and it's arguably the dimension that makes their psychological situation most distinct from any modern relationship we've discussed. Their love was, from its very earliest public stages, a political act, not a private feeling that became public over time the way most relationships do, but something that was, from the moment it became known, immediately and relentlessly interpreted as a statement about power, civilization, loyalty, and empire. This matters for a specific, concrete reason. There is a category of relationship that psychologists studying public figures have begun to examine carefully in recent decades, sometimes called the performed relationship. Not performed in the sense of being fake, but performed in the sense of being required by circumstance and public pressure to mean something beyond what it simply is between two specific people. Every couple who has ever had their relationship become the subject of significant public attention, whether political, cultural, or professional, knows a version of what this means. The relationship stops belonging entirely to the two people in it. It starts belonging partially to everyone watching, to the narratives people needed it to fulfill, the symbols they needed it to carry, and the hopes or fears they project onto it. The two people inside that relationship face a specific grueling task most private couples never encounter: holding on to what is genuinely real between them. Underneath and against the accumulated weight of everything, the relationship is being made to mean by everyone watching from the outside. Antony and Cleopatra were navigating this in its most extreme possible form. Their relationship was simultaneously a love affair and a geopolitical realignment. Every meal they shared publicly was read as a diplomatic statement. Every child they named was a territorial claim. Every gift he gave her was analyzed in Rome as an act of betrayal against the empire. The private reality between them, the fish jokes, the dissolved pearls, the laughter and arguments and ordinary dailiness of two people who genuinely knew each other, was constantly being overwritten in the public record by the geopolitical significance everyone else assigned to it. This is something a couple named James and Priya understood in a very different, much smaller, much more modern way. James was a mid-level politician in a state legislature. Priya, a physician. When they married, the fact that one was black and the other South Asian became, in their small political community, more visible than either of them had anticipated. People who supported them read their marriage as a symbol of progress. People who didn't read it as a provocation. Neither reading had much to do with the actual relationship, with the specific way James made Priya laugh, or the specific way Priya knew, before James did, when he was too tired to make a good decision, or the actual texture of two specific people building a specific life together. What James and Priya eventually had to learn to do, and what they described as genuinely difficult, even with the full support of friends, family, and a therapist who specialized in couples navigating public visibility. was how to periodically strip away all the symbolic weight their relationship carried in the world outside their front door, and reconnect with the much simpler, much less freighted reality of two people who had chosen each other for reasons that had nothing to do with what their choice was supposed to mean to anyone watching. "We had to keep coming back to the basics," Priya said, describing what had helped most. "Not what we meant to other people, what we actually meant to each other. Those are not the same conversation. You have to keep having both, and you can't let one crowd out the other." Antony and Cleopatra never learned to do that, or, more precisely, they may never have had the private protected space in which to do it. Their relationship existed at such a scale of public significance that the "what we mean to each other" conversation was almost impossible to have without the "what we mean to everyone else" conversation immediately pushing its way back in. Every moment of private clarity between them was surrounded, on all sides, by the relentless pressure of an empire deciding what that moment meant. There's a specific kind of psychological fatigue that researchers studying public figures and their relationships have documented, sometimes called narrative exhaustion. The experience of living inside a story being told about you by the outside world that increasingly diverges from your own experience of your own life, until the effort of maintaining both the public story and the private reality simultaneously becomes simply too costly to sustain. Public figures whose relationships become symbols of hope, of corruption, of cultural change, of moral failure, report a specific kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone, and everything to do with feeling fundamentally unseen by a world that can only see what your relationship represents rather than what it actually is. Antony experienced this loneliness in its most concentrated possible form. By the final years of his life, the story Rome was telling about his relationship with Cleopatra had diverged so completely from his own experience of it. 2 decades of love, laughter, an equal meeting of minds, children, real partnership, real grief, that the gap between the two had become almost unbridgeable. Rome saw a bewitched general, he experienced a person. Rome saw a seductress, he experienced a partner. Rome saw an empire's destruction, he experienced a life. That gap between the story a watching world tells about your love and the love you actually live is something almost anyone who has ever felt genuinely misunderstood in a relationship, by family, by community, by public opinion, will recognize in some form. The specific details scale down dramatically, but the core experience of loving someone in a way the people watching you cannot quite see, or will not quite allow, is one of the most universally human things in this entire 2,000-year-old story. The man who never dissolved. There's one last figure worth bringing into this story before we close, because his life offers the clearest possible contrast to everything we've traced in Antony's slow transformation. Octavian, the cold, patient 26-year-old who would eventually become Augustus, Rome's first emperor, ruling for over 4 decades, presents an almost perfect psychological countercase to Antony. Where Antony's identity dissolved into total fusion with Cleopatra, Octavian spent his entire adult life doing something deliberately, almost coldly opposite. He married twice for clear, strategic reasons, maintained relationships with advisors and family that he never allowed to override his own independent judgment, and built one of the most successful political careers in human history precisely by never once allowing personal passion to override calculated self-interest. Here's the uncomfortable question this contrast raises, and it's worth sitting with honestly rather than rushing past it. Was Octavian's approach actually healthier in some meaningful sense than Antony's? Look closely at the historical record of both men's personal lives, and the answer is more complicated than a simple yes or no. Octavian's marriage to his third and final wife, Livia, lasted over 50 years, until his death, by most accounts a genuine partnership built on real mutual respect and political collaboration, the two of them functioning almost as co-rulers in private. Even though Roman law and custom kept Livia formally outside official political power, there's reasonable evidence Octavian loved her deeply, in his own controlled, undemonstrative way. But there's also evidence that his capacity for that kind of controlled, guarded intimacy came at its own cost. Several ancient sources describe Octavian as a man who struggled throughout his life to express vulnerability openly, who maintained a careful emotional distance even from people closest to him, who treated his own family relationships, including with his children and grandchildren, with the same calculated caution he applied to political alliances. This offers a final important nuance to everything this story has been building toward. The lesson here was never that Antony's mistake was loving too intensely, and Octavian's wisdom was loving with appropriate restraint. Both men, in their own ways, represent a kind of imbalance. Antony erring entirely toward fusion, losing every independent ground to stand on. Octavian erring entirely toward control, perhaps never allowing himself the kind of total, vulnerable surrender that makes deep intimacy possible in the first place. A therapist studying attachment patterns across both extremes has described this as a spectrum, with healthy, secure attachment sitting somewhere in the genuine middle. Neither the total dissolution of self that destroyed Antony, nor the guarded, controlled distance that may have limited how deeply Octavian was ever able to be known by the people closest to him, even within a 50-year marriage that lasted, by any external measure, successfully until death. The goal was never simply to love less than Antony did. It was to love with the kind of security that allows total presence and total vulnerability without total dissolution. To be capable, simultaneously, of the deep, electric intimacy Antony and Cleopatra shared at their best, and the steady, independent groundedness that might have let either of them answer a hard question honestly, even on the worst night of their lives. There's a final modern couple worth including here. Greg and Hannah, both in their second marriages after earlier relationships that had failed in opposite directions. Greg's first marriage had ended after years of exactly the kind of guarded emotional distance Octavian seemed to embody. A wife who eventually left, telling him plainly that she'd never once felt like she'd actually reached him, despite 15 years of marriage. Hannah's first marriage had ended in the opposite direction entirely. Total, consuming fusion with a husband who, much like Antony, had eventually lost every independent capacity to function as a grounded person, leaving Hannah exhausted from essentially managing two adult lives instead of sharing one. When Greg and Hannah met, both in their 40s, both carrying the specific wisdom of having lived through opposite failures, they did something unusually deliberate for a new relationship. They talked explicitly and repeatedly, in their first year together, about exactly this balance. How to build real intimacy without either of them disappearing into it. How to stay close without either of them building walls the other couldn't get past. We actually use the words out loud, Hannah said, describing their relationship 5 years in. If one of us starts feeling like we're losing track of our own opinion on something, and if one of us starts feeling distant, we say that too. It sounds clinical. It isn't. It's just two people who both got badly burned in opposite directions, finally being honest about what they're actually scared of. This is perhaps the most practical, most directly applicable lesson buried inside this entire 2,000-year-old story of empires and asps and golden barges. The work was never simply choosing between Antony's path and Octavian's. It's the ongoing daily work of building something in the deliberate middle, close enough to lose yourself in occasionally, on the best nights, grounded enough to always find your way back, especially on the worst ones. Robert. And the half that has to learn to stand alone. There's one final story worth telling before we move toward the close, and it comes not from ancient Alexandria but from a hospital room in suburban Ohio, 4 years ago, because it makes the deepest truth of Antony and Cleopatra's ending completely concrete. Robert was 65, recently retired, sitting beside his wife's hospital bed, during what both of them understood, without needing to say it out loud, were going to be her final weeks. They had been married 41 years. In that hospital room, in the strange, suspended time that surrounds a dying spouse, Robert told a hospice chaplain something that has stayed with grief counselors who heard the story secondhand, because of how precisely it echoes what we've spent this entire story trying to understand about Antony. I keep trying to remember who I was before her, Robert said, not in a sad way. I just realized I genuinely can't. There isn't a version of me that exists separately from 41 years of being half of something. I don't know how to be the other half on its own. This is the same fusion we watched destroy Antony, expressed across 41 years of healthy, loving, mutually devoted marriage instead of a decade of crisis and political catastrophe. And here's the crucial distinction that finally separates Robert's experience from Antony's. The distinction that matters most for anyone watching this and wondering whether deep fusion with a partner is inherently dangerous. Robert's identity hadn't dissolved into his wife's, it had grown slowly, deliberately, over 4 decades into a genuinely shared identity that both of them had built together with full independent capacity intact the entire time. Choosing each other freshly across 41 years of ordinary days, illnesses, job changes, the births of children and grandchildren, none of it happening under conditions of constant existential threat. The difference between Robert's fusion and Antony's fusion isn't the depth of the connection. By any measure, Robert's was deeper, having survived 4 times as many years as Antony and Cleopatra's relationship ever got the chance to. The difference is that Robert's fusion was built slowly, through stable conditions, with both partners retaining independent friendships, independent capacities, independent judgment, exercised daily across decades of ordinary life, even as their identities grew genuinely, beautifully intertwined. Antony's fusion happened rapidly, under conditions of constant crisis, with almost no outside perspective ever allowed to interrupt or check it, until there was no independent capacity left to retain. This is the final, most important idea this story has to offer, and it deserves to be stated as its own complete thought. The goal was never to avoid deep fusion with someone you love. Healthy, long-term relationships absolutely involve real, profound merging of identity over enough time. Robert's grief at the foot of his wife's hospital bed is proof of something genuinely beautiful, not something pathological. The goal is building that fusion under conditions that preserve, rather than erase, each partner's independent capacity to think, choose, and stand on their own ground when it matters most, through ordinary daily life, through honest outside friendships, through enough stability that the fusion grows organically, instead of being forced into existence by years of shared crisis. Robert's wife died 11 days after that conversation with the hospice chaplain. Robert, now 69, has spent the years since slowly, painfully rebuilding an independent identity he hadn't needed to access in over 4 decades. Not because his marriage was wrong to be as fused as it was, but because death eventually asks every deeply fused partner to do the hardest work imaginable, become again a single complete person, after decades of genuinely, healthily being half of 2. William, and the thing he mistook for love. There's one more figure worth bringing in before we close. A man named William, 70, who spent 35 years building a career he was deeply proud of, working consistently long hours, telling himself and his family that the sacrifice was an act of love, a way of providing security and opportunity neither he nor his wife had grown up with. William retired at 68, expecting, he later admitted, to finally have the unhurried time with his wife and adult children he'd been postponing for 3.5 decades. What he found instead, in his first year of retirement, was a wife who had built an entire, rich, independent life across those 35 years. Her own friendships, her own routines, her own sense of self, grown necessarily in the considerable space his long absences had left behind, and children who loved him but who had, in the most practical sense, grown up mostly without him in the room. "I wish I'd spent less time at work," William said in an interview conducted as part of a long-running study on end-of-life regrets among older adults. Not because the work was wrong, because I told myself for 35 years that working that hard was the same thing as loving them. And it took retiring to realize those were never actually the same thing at all. Here's the connection back to Antony and Cleopatra, and it's the bridge into the final lessons of this entire story. Antony believed, by every indication in the historical record, that the empire he was building with Cleopatra, the donations of Alexandria, the vision of a blended Roman-Egyptian dynasty, was itself an act of love, both for her and for the future their children would inherit. He never seemed to fully grasp, until it was too late to act on the realization, that the relentless pursuit of that grand vision had quietly cost him the very thing it was supposed to be protecting. A stable, sustainable, independently anchored relationship capable of surviving contact with the real world. William's regret and Antony's tragedy are, underneath the surface, the exact same lesson, just told at radically different scales. Both men believed for years that intensity of effort, political ambition in one case, professional ambition in the other, was the same thing as genuine presence and partnership. Both men discovered far too late to fully undo the cost, that it wasn't. What outlived them? Before we turn to the final lessons, it's worth spending a moment on something that didn't die with Antony and Cleopatra. The way Egypt itself remembered her, separate from the version of her that traveled back to Rome as propaganda. While the Latin poets were busy turning Cleopatra into a monster for Octavian's benefit, in Egypt she continued to be remembered, for generations, in the language of the religion she had spent her entire reign deliberately associating herself with. She had presented herself throughout her life as the living incarnation of Isis, the goddess of motherhood, magic, sovereignty, appearing at public ceremonies dressed in the goddess's traditional regalia, and minting coins that paired her own image with divine iconography, in a way no Roman woman of the period could have gotten away with. This wasn't vanity, It was a calculated act of statecraft, aimed at an Egyptian population who needed to see their ruler as something more than a Greek-descended queen with a Macedonian name. And it worked well enough that, centuries after Rome had absorbed Egypt into its empire, local religious devotion to Isis, and the imagery associated with her, continued to flourish across the Mediterranean world, carrying an echo of the queen who had once made herself the goddess's living face. There's something worth sitting with in that contrast. Two competing afterlives were built for the same woman at almost the same moment. One in Rome, engineered to justify a war that turned her into a seductress and a warning. One in Egypt, older and less politically convenient to erase, that remembered her as a ruler who had tried, with real skill, to hold her kingdom together against forces far larger than herself. Neither afterlife is the whole truth, but knowing that the second one existed at all is a useful corrective to how completely the first one has dominated the last 2,000 years of retelling. 3 lessons. Everything this story has to teach comes down, finally, to 3 lessons. The third one is the one worth carrying with you longest. Here's the first, and it's the gentlest one to start with. Intensity is not the same thing as foundation. The most consuming, most electric, most fate-feeling connection you've ever had in your life is not automatically the relationship built to last. And the absence of that overwhelming intensity in a calmer, steadier relationship doesn't automatically mean something is missing. Antony and Cleopatra had extraordinary intimacy and extraordinary passion, by Sternberg's own framework, nearly from the very first afternoon on that golden barge. What they never got the chance to build, because the world around them never allowed for it, was the slow, unglamorous architecture of sustained commitment that turns intensity into something that can actually survive contact with ordinary life. If what you have right now feels quieter than you expected love to feel, that quiet isn't necessarily a warning sign. Sometimes quiet is exactly what stability sounds like. Here's the second, and it's harder to hear. Watch for the moment fusion starts to feel like the only ground you're standing on. Healthy love grows 2 people into something genuinely shared, the way it did for Robert across 41 years. But it does that while leaving each person enough independent ground to still answer a hard question honestly, even when the question is about the relationship itself. The danger was never that Antony loved Cleopatra too deeply. The danger was that, somewhere in a decade of crisis, propaganda, and isolation from honest outside perspective, he lost every inch of ground he could have stood on to answer her question independently. If you can no longer imagine who you'd be, what you'd want, or what you'd choose without your partner's voice already inside the answer, that's worth examining honestly, with someone you trust. Before a crisis forces the examination on you the way it was forced on him. And here's the third, the one worth leaving you with, because it's the one this entire story was actually about underneath everything else. The most devastating loss in this entire 2,000-year-old story was never the empire. It wasn't even really the deaths, tragic as they were. The most devastating loss was quieter than that, and it happened slowly, over a decade, almost invisibly, long before either of them ever drew a sword or reached for a basket of figs. It was the loss of two people's ability to step outside their own story long enough to see it clearly, to hear a warning and actually weigh it, to ask a hard question and actually answer it, to stay tethered even while loving someone completely, to a version of themselves capable of choosing, rather than simply following wherever the relationship's own momentum carried them. That's the thing worth protecting in your own life, starting today, regardless of how deeply you love the person across the table from you. Not distance, not guardedness, not holding part of yourself back out of fear. Just this, keep a thread, even one thin thread, connecting you back to honest outside perspective, to people who knew you before this relationship and will tell you the truth even when it's uncomfortable. To your own independent capacity to sit with a hard question and actually answer it. Love someone with everything you have. Build a shared life so fused it would be genuinely hard, the way it was for Robert. But don't let that fusion happen in isolation, under crisis, without anyone outside the relationship ever allowed to check whether the story the two of you are telling each other still matches the world you actually live in. Cleopatra asked Antony a question on the last night that mattered, and he couldn't answer it, because somewhere along the way he had stopped being able to. That's not a story about a weak man, or a wicked queen, or a love too big for the world to hold. It's a story about what happens to anyone, regardless of how brilliant, how powerful, how deeply in love, when the relationship becomes the only mirror left, and nobody's left standing outside it to say gently, before it's too late, I think you've lost sight of where you end and this love begins. So here's the question worth sitting with more than any question about Cleopatra or Antony at all. If someone who loves you asked you right now, today, a version of the same question she asked him, what do you actually want, separate from what this relationship wants? Could you answer it? Not perfectly, not without thinking, just honestly, from somewhere that's still genuinely, independently yours. 2,000 years ago, an empire fell because two people loved each other so completely that neither of them, in the end, had anywhere left to stand alone. Don't let that be the ending of your story. Build something that can hold both. A love big enough to lose yourself in, and a self steady enough to always be found again. 3 things to actually try. Before we close, it's worth pausing on something practical. Not the big philosophical lessons, but 3 concrete things that research and history both suggest actually change outcomes. Specific enough to try starting tonight if you want to. The first is something the relationship researcher John Gottman calls turning toward bids, one of the most predictive factors his team has ever identified for long-term relationship satisfaction. A bid is any small attempt at connection. A comment, a shared observation, a question, a touch, a look. Gottman's research found that couples in stable, happy, long-term relationships turn toward each other's bids, responded, acknowledged, engaged, roughly 87% of the time. Couples who eventually divorced or separated turned toward bids roughly 33% of the time, not during fights, but during ordinary daily life. The fish joke Antony made in Alexandria, the one Cleopatra turned into a sharper, funnier joke the next day, that was a bid, and her response was a masterclass in turning toward it. The problem was never the bids or the turning. It was the infrastructure of empire that kept collapsing the space in which bids could accumulate into something stable. If you have that space, and most people watching this do, the simplest, most research-backed thing you can do today is turn toward the next bid your partner makes. Even the small ones, even the badly timed ones, even when you're tired. The second is something the therapist Terry Real, who specializes in relational recovery, calls the adaptive child versus the wise adult. Real's framework observes that most of us, under relationship stress, don't respond as the most mature, resourceful version of ourselves. We respond as the child we once were, the child who learned in our family of origin that love was safe or unsafe, reliable or unpredictable, something to be earned or something freely given. The pattern we watched in Antony, a fusion born perhaps of a man who needed at some deep level to be the most important person in someone's world in order to feel fully real, is an adaptive child's pattern. It made sense once, somewhere in his formation as a person. It stopped making sense the moment it started overriding his adult judgment as a general, a husband, a political figure. Identifying your own adaptive child pattern, the emotional reflex you bring to love that was formed before you had any say in it, isn't therapy speak for its own sake. It's the difference between responding to your partner and responding to the ghost of someone who hurt you long before your partner existed. The third is the simplest and possibly the hardest. Tell someone outside your relationship, regularly and honestly how your relationship is actually going. Not to complain, not to recruit allies, simply to maintain a functioning outside perspective. A person or people who know you well enough and care enough to notice when you're telling of your own story stops quite matching what they can see from the outside. This is the shape of the hole in Antony's life. It's what every departed friend and defected officer represented. A loss not of loyalty, but of honest outside witness. Keeping that witness alive deliberately, even when it's uncomfortable, even when part of you would rather not have anyone checking, is the single most practical thing available to you to protect against the particular kind of drift this story has been describing. It doesn't have to be formal. It can be a friend you have coffee with once a month, a family member who knew you before this relationship, a therapist, anyone whose job it is to tell you the truth, even when the bubble you've built is telling you something else. This third one is worth seeing in action because it's easy to nod along with in theory and much harder to actually build. A couple named Mara and Devon, married 9 years, credit an unglamorous monthly habit with catching adrift in their own relationship before it became anything close to what happened in Alexandria. Early in their marriage, at the suggestion of an older couple they'd known for years, they started having dinner once a month with that same couple, with one unspoken rule. At some point in the evening, each of them would answer a version of the same question, asked gently and without an agenda. How's it actually going? The two of you. Not a status update. Not a performance for people they wanted to impress. An honest answer, given out loud, to people who had known them both before they were a couple, and who had earned the right to hear something true. For years the answer was some version of good, busy, normal. Then, in their 6th year of marriage, during a stretch when Devon had taken on a demanding new job, and Mara had quietly started making most of their major decisions alone, because it was faster than looping him in, the older couple noticed something in how they were both answering, a flatness, a way of talking about my schedule and my plans, rather than ours. They asked a direct follow-up question neither Mara nor Devon had thought to ask themselves. When was the last time you two actually made a decision together, start to finish, instead of one of you deciding and the other one finding out? Neither of them had a good answer. That single uncomfortable dinner conversation is, by their own account, the reason they caught the pattern at 6 years instead of at 16. It wasn't dramatic, Mara said. Nobody cried. It was just somebody outside the marriage saying the quiet part out loud before we could keep pretending we hadn't noticed it ourselves. That's the entire function outside witness is supposed to serve. Not rescue, not intervention. Just a mirror held up early enough that you still have room to adjust course on your own terms, the way Antony, surrounded near the end by nobody who remembered him from before, never got the chance to. Antony had people like that once. He just stopped listening to them, one departure at a time, until there was no one left to ask the question. You don't have to make the same choice.